design of your research procedures encompasses your overall approach to research as well as the specific components of how it will be carried out. In choosing a research design, it's fine to start out with the idea of using experimental designs or survey research as an overall approach, but before starting, you're gonna need to iron out the specifics. What are your variables? How will you measure them? Who is eligible to be in your study and who is actually in it? Eventually, you are going to need to get very specific. In this lecture, we're gonna focus on some of the key considerations involved in choosing an overall approach. In later lectures, we'll dig deeper into some of these different approaches to consider the specific types of choices involved. Now, a key point here is that there are a lot of choices. We could do an entire course on survey research, another one on experiments, and a third on ethnography. We could do multiple courses on each one. The goal of this course is not to make you an expert on any individual approach to research design, but it's to introduce you to the wide range of approaches available so you're equipped to know the best way to tackle your project. It's great to be an expert on survey research, but if your project is better suited for an individual case study, you'd be out of luck. So in this next section of the course, we're going to make sure you know what your options are. Now, there are a lot of ways to categorize different research methods. For our purposes in this course, we're going to use a straightforward and common way of organizing these methods, and we'll put them into two categories: quantitative and qualitative. Now, quantitative analysis generally involves using statistical tools to analyze large amounts of numerical data on a large number of cases. And qualitative analysis is typically looking at a smaller number of cases but more in-depth, using data that can't always be reduced to numbers. So, quantitative designs tend to produce data useful for quantitative analysis, and the same goes for qualitative designs. Now, that's not a rigid rule, by the way. You can do surveys that are analyzed qualitatively, and you can do quantitative analysis as part of a case study. But it's still a useful way to categorize some of our options, so for now, let's work with this division. Now, I'm not going to talk about every possible methodology you could use within each of these categories, but here I'm going to briefly introduce some of the most dominant methods used in research. In future lectures, we're going to go into more depth on how to do each of these. We're going to focus on three kinds of generally quantitative approaches: experimental designs, observational designs such as cross-sectional and longitudinal studies, and large-scale survey research. Now, experimental designs, proper controlled experiments with random assignment, controls, and treatments, they produce a kind of magic that allows us to be very precise about the connections between our variables. They let us do all kinds of things that other designs don't let us. We can control how variables are manipulated for our subjects, letting us really isolate the impact of variables that we think matter. The researcher has a lot of control over how the data is collected. And because of this, there is a good rule of thumb to follow. If you can answer your research question using a proper experiment, you probably should. This is one reason why the natural sciences tend to focus largely on experiments. Chemicals, plants, minerals, they pretty rarely protest at participating in an experiment. Experiments are also widely used in psychology, and the principles of experimental design can be applied to surveys and other kinds of studies, as we'll learn about. But plenty of questions and projects do not lend themselves to experimenting, so you might need to pick a different method. Now, that method might be cross-sectional or longitudinal studies. If experiments are magic, then these more observational style studies are good old-fashioned detective work. With these methods, we can't control our subjects the same way we can with experiments, but instead of manipulating variables and seeing what happens, we have to simply observe the world as it is and figure out what we can about how it works. The typical approach is to take a large data set that has information on a host of variables, and then we'll conduct statistical analysis to look for correlation or causation. A cross-sectional design examines a set of cases at a single point in time, as if you were making a cut across space to look at a wide cross-section of a population. Now, that population might be individuals, as in a national survey. In such cases, you're taking a cross-section of people, and you're reviewing their attitudes, behaviors, or beliefs at a particular point in time. But you could also compare different countries to each other at a single point in history, or businesses, or organizations, or households, or anything really. Now, longitudinal designs look at a case over time. They let you look at trends and changes over time by gathering multiple points of data about a case over a period of time. This can be particularly useful if variables change in value. If, for example, you study a single country from 1815 to 2015, you might see massive changes that can be attributed to a change in a single variable over 200 years. You can actually combine both of these methods and do a design that is both cross-sectional and longitudinal. In such a study, you would compare different units to each other over time. If you wanted to compare the experiences of children in different parts of the United States as they grow from birth to adulthood, you'd be conducting a study that is both cross-sectional and longitudinal. And you can also do correlational studies that focus on looking for relationships between variables, often in existing data sets or ones that you build. Now, we aren't going to have a separate lecture on all these designs, but it's important to know about them as you may want to do a study that requires statistical analysis of big data sets. Another quantitative method is large-scale survey research, which, as I mentioned a moment ago, is actually a type of cross-sectional design. But it's important enough in its own right to be discussed separately, as surveys are a commonly used tool in research. In survey research, you distribute questionnaires to large numbers of people to determine their characteristics, behaviors, attitudes, values, or beliefs. Rather than experimenting on people and observing the results, you're going to let people self-report and then examine what they say. You might also compare groups across demographic indicators, which is why many surveys ask about a respondent's age, gender, race, income, and education levels. Now, what about our more qualitative approaches? These approaches generally focus on a smaller number of cases. Quantitative methods tend to sacrifice depth for breadth. We don't generally know a lot about any single case or subject, but the high variation in subjects generally gives us more room to draw conclusions about a wider population. Qualitative methods, on the other hand, allow for richer description and can be better at identifying causal mechanisms that help us understand why one variable might create change in another. Now, the principal qualitative methods we're going to review are case studies, field research, and action and evaluation research. First, we have case studies. This is any in-depth study of one or a small number of, cases, which might be individuals or groups of people, organizations, countries, states, businesses, events. The goal is to engage in extensive and in-depth description, interpretation, or explanation of the case or cases. The purpose may be to simply provide rich detail and description of a previously unknown case, to explore whether theoretical ideas apply to a specific example, or to trace the causal mechanisms connecting a set of variables. Field research is a term that captures quite a few approaches. In general, it means to go out into the field, to leave your office or home and go to the place of the people or things that you're studying. You might observe the behavior of your subjects, as a biologist might by studying animals in their natural habitat. You might instead engage in participant observation, where you become a member of the community that you hope to study or interact with your subjects as you study them. Or you might interview your subjects of interest, one-on-one in traditional interviews or in focus groups that might meet once or several times. Now, one of the better known types of this methodology is ethnography. It's a commonly used methodology in anthropology as well as in other fields. This usually entails extensive time spent in the culture or with the subjects under study, observing them in such a way as to produce thick description of those subjects, as Clifford Geertz famously did in his study of Balinese cockfights in his book, The Interpretation of Cultures. Finally, we have applied research. This is in the form of action and evaluation research. Most of the methodologies we've discussed so far focus on answering questions to satisfy our own curiosity, advance knowledge, solve puzzles, or to learn things about wider groups, even if we only study a small subset of the group we're actually interested in. Action research focuses on helping a specific group or community. It's frequently normative in its purpose, interested in resolving a problem rather than looking at wider patterns or puzzles for the sake of advancing knowledge. Instead, action research, it wants to use research to improve lives. If we can see research as a cocktail party, then action research is the person who charges the stage, takes over the microphone, and gives an impassioned speech that goes viral and makes change happen. Evaluation research, used frequently in research on education as well as many other areas, aims at evaluating the effectiveness of programs, actions, or behaviors, and their ability to solve the problem for which they were created. Typically, it involves establishing criteria for assessing the effectiveness of a program, and then the researchers analyze the program's achievement of those criteria as well as its strengths and weaknesses. So we've looked at some of the main kinds of research design, but before you can employ these methods and gather any data, you must determine your unit of analysis. That is the unit, the person, organization, government, country about which you are gathering the data. It's basically an organizing element that can guide your data collection efforts. Imagine you are interested in studying employee productivity. There are lots of ways to approach such a project. Do you want to know the productivity of individual employees, teams, offices or locations, cohorts of workers? Each of these is a unit. Whatever unit you choose is going to determine the data you collect and how it's organized. If your unit is the individual worker, you might look at the hours each person worked, the number of projects an employee completed in a year, or the total sales made by that person. But if your unit of analysis is instead an office, you wouldn't need data that's so individualized. You might want to know about total overtime paid or total sales at the office level. Which one you choose is going to depend on the purpose of your research. So if the goal is to find a high-performing employee for an award, then an individual level unit of analysis makes sense. If instead you are tasked with closing down the poorest performing office among several offices, then individual data isn't as useful. You probably need aggregate data about each office. It may be that your star employee who just won that award works at the lowest performing office. That person's data is still not going to stop you from shutting down that office. Sometimes you will want nested units. This means that you are looking at units within a unit. In our business example, this would mean getting data on a subset of employees within a specific office. So the individual level unit of analysis is embedded within that office unit of analysis. If our task was to find the high-performing employees in poorly performing offices so we can reassign them to a new location, then this kind of unit choice would be useful. The point is, knowing your unit of analysis is vital before you start gathering data. Otherwise, you're going to gather data in a haphazard way, and we strive to be as systematic as possible when it comes to research. So that is a lot of options for research designs. How are you supposed to choose which one is best for your project? Well, let's start with several key considerations to keep in mind when choosing a research design for your project. First, you need to consider your time and the resources available to you. The ideal design might require you to conduct your own data collection, but perhaps similar data is already available for free or a small fee. Running your own survey or experiment, it takes a lot of time and resources, so you should not feel compelled to do that for their own sake. For example, let's consider polls. Public opinion polling firms conduct polls all the time. The General Social Survey, for example, has asked questions about American behaviors and attitudes since 1972. Questions cover a wide variety of topics, from premarital sex to your television habits and how often you socialize with friends and family. Rather than conduct your own survey on these topics, your time and money would be better spent using existing publicly available data. This, by the way, is another great reason to do your literature review sooner rather than later. By reading what data other researchers have compiled and used in this area, You'll find out what's available and potentially save yourself a lot of time and effort. Now, what if the data doesn't exist? The second consideration is whether or not there's a good reason why the data is missing. In some cases, it may be that no one has worked on a project from the angle that you have, or that the specific case or sample you want to study hasn't been tackled yet. But in some cases, the data you want may actually be really difficult or even unethical to obtain. For example, you may want to study the experiences of victims of domestic violence who still live with their abusive partners. It might be difficult to convince them to talk to you for the purposes of research. And if they agree, your work could pose serious ethical risks to you or them. As a researcher, you're supposed to protect the confidentiality of your subjects. But if your subjects tell you about ongoing experiences of violence, would you be able to stay silent? That's if, of course, your ethical review board allows the research to move forward in the first place. So always consider the difficulty and ethics of acquiring the data that you would need. A third consideration is your own skill level. You may lack the skill to do the specific study that you want. It might require advanced data analysis or formal modeling, or you might need to interview subjects in a language you don't speak. Some of these considerations can be solved by grants or other sources of funding. You might be able to hire an interpreter. But in other cases, you might consider collaborating with another researcher that can offer those skills. So either pick a research design you're confident that you can carry out, or have a plan to compensate for those areas where you might need assistance. Since I mentioned funding a moment ago, let's talk about that as our fourth consideration in the choice of research design. There is a lot of great research that can be done with no funding at all, but as in most things, money certainly helps. And for some research, it is absolutely necessary. Want to recreate Clifford Geertz's work and watch some cockfights in Bali? Well, you'll need a plane ticket, a living stipend, and possibly an interpreter or some language lessons. Surveys may require you to hire people to act as interviewers. One-on-one interviews may necessitate the hiring of a transcriber. You may need physical equipment for your research, particularly in the natural sciences, or you may need to offer an incentive to motivate people to sign up for your experiment or focus group. If you want to publish your results, some fields are turning more and more to open access publication, which can cost hundreds or thousands of dollars. All of these are the kinds of costs that you should try not to pay out of pocket. As you design your research, you're going to want to develop a budget that considers the costs of all stages of the project. Now, the good news is that there are a number of organizations out there that provide grants to fund research. If your project is something that was handed to you at your work, it is reasonable to ask for a research budget to support costs. Many academics receive a research budget to support their research from their universities, and so if conducting research is part of your job, definitely investigate the support available from your employer. That may be the easiest way to get the resources that you need. If not, it's time to look to other sources. Now, there are a number of foundations, professional associations, and government bodies that provide grants to support research. These are usually competitive processes, and you may need to apply pretty far in advance. The National Science Foundation, for example, approves approximately 11,000 proposals of the 50,000 submitted every year to support research. Depending on the type of grant, you may be subjected to pretty strict regulations and reporting requirements. Generally, when someone gives you money for something, they want strong evidence that it was spent effectively and had the impact that they were told that it would. That can create some problematic incentives, by the way. Sometimes our research doesn't turn out the way we want. We don't get the results we expected, or we weren't able to talk to the people we thought we could, or our survey response rate was unexpectedly low. Most granting institutions understand that, but at the same time, you might be tempted to artificially inflate your findings, perhaps so that you're considered for future grants, simply to justify the institution's faith in you, or because you believe that your career might be damaged if you report disappointing results. This raises clear ethical concerns that you should be aware of. Certainly, you should resist any and all impulses to falsify your research. And if ever a granting institution encourages you to claim specific findings or to massage your results to show what isn't there, don't give in, and maybe don't accept their money. A final set of considerations for your choice of research design has to do with the structure of your question and variables. There is a reason why certain approaches are associated with certain disciplines, like field work with anthropology and experiments with the natural sciences and psychology. It's at least partly due to the fact that the kinds of questions those fields are interested in can best be answered using those methodologies. Interviewing a hydrogen atom is not going to do much good, after all. Now, in my own field of international relations, conducting a true experiment is pretty difficult. I'd love to be able to convince, say, North Korea to try democracy for a while, just for the sake of research, so I can study how the society changes under different systems of government. But that's not exactly going to work out. I can't exactly manipulate variables in countries the way a chemist could in a chemistry lab. So what kinds of factors should you pay attention to as you decide what methodological approach to use? Well, one is whether or not you can control the administration of your treatment. That is, can you assign which value of your independent variable that a case falls into? Recall that, as we discussed previously, the independent variable is the factor in experiment that we vary to determine its effect on the dependent variable. In the case of studying democracy in North Korea, I can't determine which value on my independent variable the case belongs in. My independent variable is type of government. It's not up to me to decide which system of government any country has. In an experiment, I'd be able to randomly assign governments to countries and then observe the effects. Let's look at a different example. If I were studying the impact of a business's size on its treatment of its employees, my independent variable is business size, and my dependent variable, treatment of employees. I wouldn't be able to tell one company to be large and another to be small. I'd have to work with what already exists. Compare this to questions that lend themselves better to experiments. If I want to know the impact of playing with puppies on people's moods, I actually can decide whether or not someone gets to play with a puppy. I can take my subjects, divide them into two groups, and then give one group puppies. In that sense, I can manipulate the administration of my treatment. Now, there is such a thing as quasi-experimental designs that let us work around this issue of manipulating the treatment, and we will discuss them in a future lecture. A second factor is controlling for alternative variables. Alternatives to the independent variable or treatment that you really want to investigate. Are you able to isolate the factors that you think play a role in whatever outcome of interest you might have from those that you think don't matter? In an experiment, you can institute these controls yourself. You introduce a treatment to one randomly selected set of subjects, but not others, making your variable of interest the one that varies. You can also eliminate other variables by ensuring they're the same for everyone. For example, if you're doing that study on whether playing with puppies improves people's moods, you could make sure that both groups, those that play with puppies and those that don't, spend time in exactly the same room. Otherwise, the design elements or environmental conditions in that room, the furniture, the temperature, the size, might affect mood. Using the same room eliminates that variable from consideration. You don't need an experiment to control for other variables. Sometimes you can select cases that provide some of these controls. If I'm interested in the impact of government type on social and economic outcomes, for example, I could pick countries that are similar in many respects, geography, size, or dominant language, for example, but which vary on their type of government. If countries of the same size have radically different social and economic outcomes, I can probably safely eliminate size as a cause of those outcomes. In our business example from earlier, you could study companies that are very similar except for size, and therefore control for and eliminate from consideration those factors that were similar. Or you could just look at small companies and see if there are any differences between them when it comes to treatment of employees. Now, what about large correlation studies using big data sets? You can control there too. When you analyze big data sets with lots of variables, you can use statistical methods to control for alternative explanations, and we will talk about how to do this in a future lecture. Now, of course, sometimes you don't actually care about controlling for or manipulating variables at all. If your work is focused on description, then manipulation and control aren't really key considerations for you. An experiment would be unsuitable, but fieldwork or focus groups might be just right. A third factor to consider is the number of subjects or cases that you either need or have access to. If your project requires you to analyze a large number of cases, then you need to choose a method that can more readily produce that data. Experiments and surveys tend to produce data that lends themselves to quantitative analysis. So does the building or use of large data sets in correlation research. But if your question instead requires that you go more in-depth on a single or small number of cases or subjects, you are better off choosing fieldwork, focus groups, interviews, or archival work. Your ideal choice may be constrained by funding, skills, or any of the other key considerations we discussed earlier that are going to influence your choice of design. The point here is that such considerations may limit or expand your access to subjects, and the number of subjects you want or need will in part dictate your choice of design. In our puppy example, the more people, the merrier. The larger our number of cases, our N as we sometimes call it, generally the better our statistical tools will be at telling us whether playing with puppies improves moods. In the case of looking at the impact of government type on social and economic outcomes, I'm probably going to want to use existing data sets, or build my own, that looks at many countries over time. A cross-sectional and longitudinal analysis will let me not only compare different countries to each other, but the same country to itself over time as its regime changes. Now, that is a tall order, and it's going to require some pretty serious stats chops. And there may also be a lot of missing data. So I could instead do a case study or two, looking in depth at a single country or a handful, and really dig into the causal mechanisms underlying why government type might influence my outcomes of interest. There's a similar choice in our business example. You could get data on hundreds of companies, their size, and some metrics on employee treatment. Or you could pick a few and do some in-depth case studies. Both are valid approaches. In this case, for both types of examples, the type of question narrows the choice of available methods, but it doesn't force you to pick just one. Experiments might be out for both of those projects, but that doesn't mean you're forced to do a large and quantitative study. Some of the best research takes what is called a mixed method approach. This usually means a combination of methods, perhaps a quantitative study to look at the breadth of information on a set of subjects, and then a qualitative study to investigate details or causal mechanisms of a few relevant cases. This combination of breadth and depth can be a very powerful way to get at the answers to your research questions. Okay, we have considered a lot of factors that influence what type of design you should choose. At this point, you should be ready to identify the type of data you need to answer your question and the method you're going to use to find and analyze that data. I know you're raring to go, but you still have a couple of decisions to make before you can start designing your experiment, survey, or case study. First, we have to figure out how to measure our variables. That is, how are we defining them, and how will we know them when we see them? How will I know if someone is in a good mood after playing with a puppy? What are the markers of a well-treated employee versus a poorly treated one? What exactly are those social and economic outcomes I keep referring to, and how will I compare them in one country versus another? All of that is part of measurement, the subject of our next lecture. After that, we have to figure out the methods we're going to use to find subjects or cases and to ensure that they can tell us something about a wider population. I might only check the post-puppy playing moods of 100 people, but I'm not doing a study solely to say something about those 100 people. I want to be able to say something about a wider population, say of all adults. To do that, I need to be systematic in how I choose my sample so it reflects that wider population. So after measurement, we'll turn to populations and samples, and then we'll start our in-depth look at the various methodologies we started to consider here. See you then. In this lecture, we're going to consider how we measure the concepts or phenomena that we plan to observe during our data collection. Now, to illustrate why that's important, I want you to imagine that I've taken a deck of cards and dealt you a random hand. And let's say you got the following 6 cards: the 2 of clubs, the 6 of hearts, the 6 of clubs, the 7 of spades, the 9 of spades, and the 10 of hearts. So let's play a game. Take those 6 cards and in 2 minutes, find as many ways as possible of creating arrangements of card groups. And the only rules are these. A group consists of at least 2 cards. To count, an arrangement has to have at least 2 groups, and every card must be in one group for the arrangement to count, so no leftover cards. So for example, you could group those 6 cards by suit, with 2 clubs, 2 hearts, and 2 spades. That's an arrangement with 3 groups of cards with 2 cards in each group, so that would count as 1 arrangement. How many arrangements do you think you could come up with in 2 minutes? Well, here are the ones that I came up with pretty quickly. You could arrange the cards by suit: clubs, hearts, and spades. I have 2 cards in each group in that arrangement. But how about by color? Hearts are red, and spades and clubs are black, so I have 2 red and 4 black. And we also have odd and even numbered cards, 2 odd and 4 even. Now, those are pretty easy, but how about these? Cards with the value of 6 and below versus cards above 6. That meets our rules. So do 7s and below versus 7s and above, for that matter. What about 6s and not 6s? There are 2 cards with the value of 6 and 4 with the value of not 6. There's also clubs and not clubs, hearts and not hearts, and spades and not spades. You could even do prime numbers and not prime numbers, or numbers divisible and not divisible by 3. So there are actually quite a lot of ways we can arrange these cards into groups. That same information, the 6 cards, can be organized and defined in more than a dozen ways, depending on how you view them and categorize them. So what does all this have to do with measurement? Well, let's take a look at what is meant by that term. Measurement is how we observe and catalog information about our concepts of interest and assign them numbers, symbols, definitions, and other meanings. Now, when I use the word measure, you probably think of a ruler or measuring tape, and that's not wrong. These are tools that we use to give us information about a concept of interest, such as length, width, or height, that we then assign numbers to. So if I want to know how tall my nephew is, I'll take out the tape measure and record his height in inches. The tape measure is the tool, the concept of interest is height, and the recording unit is inches. Unless, of course, we lived outside the United States, where it might be centimeters. But measurement, as we use the term in research, can go well beyond using tape measures and rulers. Imagine you are buying a car, and you want to buy the safest car on the market. So you go to a dealership and ask them how safe their latest model is. Now, since they're in the business of selling cars, they're going to fall all over themselves to tell you how safe their car is. We have anti-lock brakes, tire pressure monitoring, airbags, side airbags, and a 5-star safety rating. That sounds like a lot of safety features. But then you go to the next dealership and they're telling you about traction control and parking assist and electronic stability control. And they too have this mysterious 5-star rating, but for a different combination of features. And then you go to a third place, which doesn't have most of those specialized systems, but which will sell you a heavier car. And they say that the weight of the car is more important than anything else when it comes to safety. So which car is the safest? Now, I'm no car expert, so I don't have a ready answer to that question, but I can tell you how to go about finding an answer. To start, I want you to think about how we define words like safe in the context of a car. What does that mean conceptually? One definition might be that a safe car is one that minimizes the chances of death or extreme injury in an accident. Another is that a safe car is one that is less likely to get into an accident in the first place. Now, of course, there are others, but let's consider these two for now. The definition of safe matters a lot because different car features aim at different definitions of safety. So take seatbelts. A seatbelt is designed to minimize injury in the event of an accident, but it won't help you avoid an accident. In fact, some studies have shown that seatbelts present a moral hazard problem, that drivers wearing seatbelts might drive more recklessly and get into more accidents because the danger of injury in an accident is reduced. Similarly, a backup camera isn't going to help you once an accident starts, but it might help you avoid an accident by improving your view of cars behind you while reversing. The point is, how we define our concept of safety matters, and that even without a ruler or measuring tape, we can create a set of indicators that allow us to observe different cars and compare them in terms of how safe they are. We could, for example, create a list of all safety features and observe how many each car has, and then declare the one with the most the safest. Or we could determine a list of features that, if present, denote a car as safe, and then observe which ones meet that threshold. Or we could skip that step altogether and go straight to statistics. We could look at the record of each car model and see the percentage of accidents or accident-related deaths that occur in those cars compared to the number of those cars on the road. Armed with any of this information, we could make an informed, safe car buying decision. But without measurement, we can't do any of that. Measurement is what takes us from vague and subjective feelings about a concept to something concrete and objective that invites comparison. It's what lets us go from "this car feels safe" based on vague impressions to "this car has the best safety record on the market" based both on the number of relevant safety features and its accident record. Okay, so if measurement is that process of assigning numbers, symbols, and definitions to our concepts and variables of interest, we need to know how to go about doing that. Step number 1 is conceptually define your variable of interest. Now, a variable is a characteristic of a unit or concept that varies in value or category. So conceptualizing your variables requires you to develop a clear definition of your concept. This is important because some concepts have multiple meanings, and we want to be transparent about what exactly we mean. We've already talked about the multiple meanings of car safety. Let's consider a different example. Health. What does it mean to be healthy? Now, one definition might be that a healthy person does not have a disease. The first definition in Merriam-Webster Dictionary for healthy states, quote, "free of disease," end quote. But that's not very satisfying. Someone might not have a disease right now, but they may have a number of risk factors for disease. Other people might technically have a disease, but wouldn't really be considered unhealthy. Have you ever had a cold sore? You probably have. 90% of Americans have one at some point in their life. If you do, you probably have a virus, herpes simplex virus or HSV. Should all of us be considered unhealthy on this basis? And that's just considering physical health. What about emotional or mental health? If those aren't part of our definition, then our study will just focus on physical health, which might be considered an incomplete picture of overall health. I hope you see that it's really important to think through our definitions before we ever start looking for data. So how do we do this? Well, one place to start is the dictionary. If your variable is a general term like healthy or safety, it can be useful to understand how the term is used in general practice so you can refine your own thoughts. Now from there, you probably want to dive into the literature on your topic to see how scholars before you have defined the variable. Now this is useful for a couple of reasons. First, it can really save you some time. If you come up with your own definition, you're going to have to really refine it and defend it. If your definition isn't sound, your entire project will unravel, just as if you define health only as not physically diseased. If it's based on what other scholars have published, you can cite them. You'll still have to defend your choice, but you will have more evidence on your side. You may also find out that there's a conventional and widely accepted definition for your concept, in which case you can simply cite it and move on, so long as that definition fits your understanding and need for the concept. Now, if there aren't already clear conceptual definitions for your topic, that's okay. Developing a new and compelling definition for a concept can be a scientific contribution in its own right. Let's move on to step number 2. Operationalize your variables. Now, operationalizing a variable means determining what indicators we'll look for to show us where our subject under study falls on that variable. It's simply the observable markers that we look for to help us assess and then categorize our subjects. In the case of healthy, this would mean the indicators we will evaluate to determine whether one person is healthy and another person not healthy. In terms of car safety, these are the factors we examine to classify one car as safe and another as not safe. As with many aspects of research design, this isn't optional. You can't skip this step and just decide to figure it out later. Remember, our job is to be systematic, neutral, and replicable. If you don't start with clear rules on how to observe your concepts, you're very likely going to be biased toward finding the results you want and ignoring those you don't. This is something we see all the time in partisan political behavior. The same behaviors by politicians, flip-flopping on positions, or say, engaging in poor cybersecurity behavior, are rarely evaluated objectively by their supporters. Instead, if the person is in our political party or group, we might defend, minimize, or dismiss the behavior while attacking a political opponent for something similar. Now, that may make for entertaining politics, but it's a lousy way to go about doing empirical research. Finally, keep in mind that we want to be transparent so that our work can be replicated. For that, we need clear procedures, including procedures on how we will measure and observe our variables. If your procedures aren't clear, there's no way for me to replicate your results. So how do we go about operationalizing a variable? Well, the first step is to figure out what the possible observable indicators are of your variable. Using the definition that you created, consider how we would observe the incidence or absence of that variable in the real world. What kinds of behaviors or evidence would tell us about this characteristic of a subject? Consider the variable health. Let's say for a second that we decided to conceptually define this as disease-free. Yes, I know we discussed why that's not a great definition, but just go with me on this for a second. What kinds of indicators would we look for to categorize our subjects as either diseased or disease-free? One option might be to operationalize diseased as a subject that reports being recently diagnosed with or treated for a disease by a doctor. That, however, would omit people who may have a disease but aren't seeking treatment, maybe because they don't know about it or because they can't afford medical care. Instead, we could try a different operationalization, such as a subject that reports experiencing chronic pain or lack of regular full body function due to a physical ailment. That would capture the people who haven't seen a doctor. But it might also capture people with long-term joint pain due to an old knee injury, not exactly someone we might call diseased, and it would preclude anyone suffering from mental health disease. The point, though, is that both of these are operationalized definitions of our concept. In each case, they'll allow us to gather data about our subjects who we could then categorize into groups by our variable of interest, health. The next thing we have to do is determine how many categories we want within a given variable and what those categories should be. So far, for healthy, we've been using unhealthy and healthy. There are only two options there, but we could instead use a wider and more precise set of categories, perhaps a 5-point scale of very unhealthy to very healthy, with a neither healthy nor unhealthy option in the middle. These categories within the variable are often called values. Part of the operationalization process is determining what the theoretical range of values will be for your variables. Imagine you walk into a child's playroom and it's filled with toys all over the floor. Along one wall are a series of unlabeled toy boxes, and you need to come up with a system to organize the toys and then label the boxes. What do you do? Well, one option could be to organize the toys by age of the child. One box could be labeled infant, another toddler, and a third preschooler. Or you could organize by color. One box for blue toys, another for red toys, and a third for black toys. Or you could organize by function, with a box for building toys, another for dolls, and a third for art supplies. Your organization method, age of the child, color, or function, that's the variable. The labels on the toy boxes, those are your values. Now, one important thing to keep in mind when determining your values is how precise you want them to be. Earlier, I said I wanted to measure my nephew's height. I could record his height in inches, which would be very precise. But I could instead simply use the categories of tall and short and select a threshold to act as the cutoff between the two. Now, tall and short is a low level of precision, while the exact number of inches is a much higher level of precision. Sometimes you want a higher level of precision, other times it's not necessary, or it might even distort your data if you use values that are too precise. We actually have 4 main levels of measurement. In order from least precise to most precise, they are nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. The nominal level of measurement simply means we have a difference between at least 2 values within the variable. But we can't rank the values or order them in a meaningful way. A simple list of colors would be at the nominal level of measurement. The colors differ from each other, but one isn't more color than another, they just differ from each other. What about if there's no difference between the values? Well, in that case, we don't have a variable anymore, we have a constant. A constant is a characteristic where there is no variation. Every subject has the same value. Now, a good example of a nominal measure is marital status. As we've previously discussed, the values of this variable are typically single, married, divorced, and widowed, although sometimes you see more categories included, such as separated or partnered. Note that these are all different categories of marital status, but we can't order them in a meaningful way. Is divorced more or less marital status than widowed? That doesn't make sense, which is why this measure and others like it, such as race, ethnicity, nationality, or religious denomination, tend to be at the nominal level of measurement. They're just different categories, with no one value higher or lower than any other. The next level is ordinal measures. Now, at this level, we still have the difference between categories, but we gain the ability to rank order them. We can clearly define a highest and lowest, or tallest and shortest, or youngest and oldest, and put all the values in order along the spectrum. We can't yet define distances between these categories, but we know who came in first and who came in last. And this is more precise than nominal measures. Age can be defined at the ordinal level. If we put people into categories such as child, young adult, adult, and senior, we're using a ranking system. Another example would be your university year, freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior. Or think about officer ranks in the armed services. In all of these cases, we can rank the different values in a meaningful way. Our next level is the interval level of measurement. Here, we have the difference between categories from nominal measures and the ranking we get from ordinal measures, but we add the ability to define distances between categories. A variable at the interval level lets us clearly measure how far it is between one value and the next. Unlike nominal and ordinal, it requires numbers. The classic example of an interval measure is temperature. We know that 70 degrees is different from 40 degrees, a difference between categories. We also can rank it against other values of temperature. We know, for example, that 70 degrees is greater than 40 degrees and less than 80 degrees. But now we can say something more. We can note that 70 degrees is 30 degrees more than 40 degrees. So now we can clearly measure the distance between two values along the same variable. We couldn't do that with our ordinal measure of age. What's the numerical difference between child, young adult, and adult? The categories are less precise, and we can't define a numerical distance between them. We can determine age at the interval level. Consider the year of birth. We can say that someone born in 1960 has a different year of birth from someone born in 1980. We can also rank those two categories and say that the person born in 1960 is older than the person born in 1980. We gain one more piece of information, though. We can say that the person born in 1960 is 20 years older than the person born in 1980. Being able to quantify that distance is that added level of precision that puts us at the interval level of measurement. Ratio, our final level of measurement, adds a subtle layer of precision to variables at the interval level. At the ratio level of measurement, we introduce to our variable a true zero and the idea of the absence of the characteristic. Zero is meaningful in a ratio measure. It indicates the absence of whatever it is that we're measuring, which enables us to talk about two subjects in ratio to each other. Let's illustrate this idea with an example. Consider the variable of income. Someone who makes $80,000 differs in income level from someone who makes $40,000, makes more than that person, and is separated from that person's income by a $40,000 difference. That covers our nominal, ordinal, and interval levels. But we can also say that the person who makes $80,000 makes twice as much as the person making $40,000. The idea of a $0 of income is meaningful here. It means the absence of income. Compare that to temperature, where 0 degrees does not mean the absence of heat, even though it's pretty cold. Or birth year, where being born in year 0 doesn't mean the absence of birth or age. So why use one level of measurement versus another? Well, there are a lot of reasons. The higher the level of measurement, the more precise the data, and the more statistical tests we can run, which is great. Another advantage to using a higher level of measurement is that if you gather very precise data, you can always later recategorize that data to a lower level of measurement. So if we're interested in height, we can precisely measure people now and then group them into less precise categories later. But if you only gather your data at a lower level of precision, you can never jump back up to a higher level of precision during the analysis stage. If my nephew is recorded only as tall, the only way to know his exact height in inches would be to go back into data collection and ask. So generally, it's better to get the more precise information first. At the same time, sometimes it's unnecessary or impractical to get more precise data. In the case of our marital status example, that data doesn't make sense at higher levels of measurement. And if I only need to know the heights of a bunch of 7-year-olds in order to put them in rows for a school picture, I might not need those heights in inches. Relative sizes such as tall and short will do. So as with everything else, your project will determine how precise your measures need to be. When all else is equal, though, you should generally aim to collect the most precise data you can. Before we finish our discussion of step 2, operationalization, we need to talk about indexes. Remember earlier when we struggled to operationalize the variable healthy using the conceptual definition disease-free? We came up with 2 possible operationalized definitions, neither of which satisfied us. In this case, our conceptual definition was pretty flawed. But let's say that we like our conceptual definition. If you can't find a single high-quality operational definition, you have a couple of options. Option number 1 is to simply note you're keeping the scope of your study narrow and focusing only on this small group that you can readily observe. Science is incremental, so even a smaller contribution than originally planned can be valuable. You can always try a different operationalization in a later study if that will bring added value. Option number 2 is to use multiple operational definitions. This is actually quite common in research. It's pretty rare that a single indicator is going to completely and accurately capture our concept. So turning to multiple indicators lets us build a more robust set of criteria for our concept. One way to do this is to build an index. An index is when you take responses to multiple items measured on the same scale and combine them to produce a single number that can represent the subject on that variable. So take our example of health. We could just use a subject's single response to whether or not they've been diagnosed or treated with an illness to represent diseased or disease-free. Or we could design a series of, say, 5 yes-no questions. We could ask our subjects if they experience chronic pain or if they lack full regular physical body function. Subjects with 5 yeses could be classified as very unhealthy and 0 as very healthy. Many indexes are more sophisticated than this and use more advanced scales, but you get the idea. Using multiple indicators and building indexes can also help improve both reliability and validity, 2 key concepts that we will discuss momentarily. So that's step 2. Step number 3 is evaluate reliability and validity. Let's look at reliability first. A reliable measure is a consistent measure. This means that the measure is going to give us a consistent result no matter how many times we employ it or who administers it. Imagine you step on a scale 5 times in the space of 1 minute. You don't change your clothes or eat anything in between. You stay exactly the same. But the scale's readings change. They come back as 110 pounds, 150 pounds, 200 pounds, 220 pounds, and 400 pounds. Would you trust this scale's measure of your weight? Of course not. It's clearly broken. Even if one of those was your true weight, we aren't getting a consistent, a reliable result. Well, the same thing goes for the measures we use in our research. We want our scale to consistently give the same results. That means 2 things. First, every time we employ the measure, assuming our subject itself hasn't changed, we should get the same result each time. Now, with inanimate objects, this can be relatively easy. A chemical is not going to protest or change its answer to a question. But if you're doing research on humans, you have to be prepared for deception, lying, refusals to answer, and other behaviors that might give you inconsistent results. We have to think about how to maximize consistency in our measures. Second, consistency can be an issue when multiple people are involved in the data collection. Let me give you 2 examples to help cement this idea for you. Have you ever heard of the Bible saying, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God? Now, there are a lot of possible explanations for this meaning of this somewhat odd statement. Why would a camel be trying to go through the eye of a needle? Some say that the needle's eye is the name of a narrow or treacherous mountain pass or gates to a city. Here's an alternate explanation. We know that the Bible was copied by hand for centuries before the advent of the printing press. Did you know that the difference between the word camel and rope in Greek is a single letter? And in Aramaic, the language Jesus would have spoken, the words for camel and rope are the same. If the reason why this saying discusses a camel rather than a rope going through the eye of a needle is that a scribe made a copying error, that's a problem of reliability. A second example comes from grading papers. All of us have probably experienced an unfair grade. A multiple choice test usually has very high reliability because there aren't any subjective measures to grade. But in an essay, the grading can be highly subjective. And if a professor grades a paper higher because it was the first in the stack, or it was early in the morning, or after petting a cat, that's an unreliable grading scheme. And if another professor using the same criteria would give it a different grade, that's also a reliability problem. Our second criteria for evaluation is validity. A valid measure is one that accurately and completely captures our concept. Now, validity has a higher threshold than reliability. A measure can be reliable without being valid, but it cannot be valid unless it is also reliable. Let's illustrate by returning to our scale example. Imagine that we have bought a new scale after our old one was such a disaster. And let's say that your true weight is 150 pounds. You weigh yourself 5 times on the new scale. The results come back as 200 pounds all 5 times. Is your scale reliable? Well, yes, it is consistently giving you the same result. But is your scale valid? No. The results may be consistently the same, but they're wrong. They are not an accurate reflection of our concept, your weight. If the scale gave us 5 different responses where only one was 150 pounds, the scale would be neither reliable nor valid. So for a measure to be valid, it must also be reliable. But a measure can be reliable without being valid. So therefore, we would say that reliability is necessary, but not sufficient for validity. There are lots of kinds of validity to consider, and we could spend hours just on this topic alone, so we're going to identify just a few. First, there's face validity. On the face of things, is your measure a good indicator of your concept? Imagine we used pet ownership as an indicator of good health. We might be able to stretch and think of a way to make it work, but on the face of it, it's not a good match for our concept. Then there's content validity, which assesses whether our measure completely captures all aspects of our concept. Remember earlier when we used disease-free as a measure of health? We questioned its content validity because it didn't completely capture all aspects of what we understand to be health. This is one reason why we often want multiple indicators of our concepts to maximize validity. Now, there are a number of other types of validity to consider, and there are tests you can use to ensure that your measures are reliable and valid. For now, however, it's important to give a lot of consideration to the measures that you choose and making sure that they accurately capture your concepts and variables of interest and that they can be measured in a consistent way. Coming up with good measures for abstract concepts can be pretty hard. Sometimes we just don't have good indicators for things we might want to observe, and many disciplines struggle with finding ways to measure concepts such as success or effectiveness. There are no perfect answers here. Look to the literature for ideas and remember to defend your decisions, and note that as a result, your claims about your findings may be limited. Remember, our goal is to make small, incremental advances. We'll find this is also the case when we pick our populations and samples, the next lesson in this course. When you're undertaking a research project, it's essential to determine the entire group of cases to which your research applies and what subset of that population you're actually going to study. I want you to imagine that you decided to attend your local gym's spinning class. For those of you that have never heard of this, spinning is a class where you hop on a stationary bicycle that lets you control the resistance in your ride. So you can simulate riding on a flat road versus a hill. An instructor leads everyone through the class, playing music to provide a beat with variations in speed, resistance, and position on the bike. Now, I used to be really into spinning, but I'm a bit of a magpie when it comes to exercise classes, so I started cheating on spinning with another kind of exercise called turbo kick, and that became a full-time relationship for a while. Recently, though, I decided to go back to spinning, dusted off my spinning shoes, and tried out a class. And within 10 minutes, my feet started to fall asleep on the pedals. I told a friend in the class about this, and she recommended that I watch my knees and make sure that they don't collapse inward during the ride. The following week, I employed her advice and found that the sleeping foot situation improved. Clearly, my friend's advice worked. My problem was my inward collapsing knees. Case solved, problem fixed, I can once again be a spinning maniac. Of course, it isn't quite so simple. Let's put this in the language of research methods. I took a data point, the condition of my feet in my first spin class. Let's say that on a pain scale of 1 to 10, my pain was a 4. We then introduced a change in behavior, or treatment, my controlling my knees to make sure they didn't fall inward. And then we took a second data point in the following class. Let's say my pain became a 2. It's very easy to assume that the treatment made the difference, but we should always be suspicious of simple answers without good data and theory. It's possible, of course, that my friend's advice made the difference in my after-class pain, but there are other possible reasons why my feet didn't hurt as much the second time. I can think of a few right off the bat. First, it may be that my feet simply needed to adjust to spinning again, and that first class set them on the way to a quicker recovery the second time. Also, since this was primarily meant as a workout and not an experiment, I changed a few other things during this second workout. I focused on lifting my feet up on the pedals rather than just pushing down. The special spinning shoes that I wear lock into the pedals, so this lifting is just as easy as pushing. I also occasionally wiggled my toes, and either of those changes might have made the difference in my pain. Another possible explanation for the change in my pain is the class structure. The instructor in the second week focused on seated interval speed drills, while in the first week we did a run with lots of standing to help get over high resistance hills. The pain was worse when I was standing on the bike rather than sitting, so those differences may explain why the second week was less painful. I also started taking a new vitamin in the week 2, which may have helped, and I didn't eat breakfast before the second workout, unlike the previous week. So as you can see, there are lots of potential reasons why my pain was less in week 2 than in week 1. Changing my knee position on the bike is only one of several possible reasons. In future lectures, we'll figure out how we could conduct a strong test of this hypothesis that proper knee position will reduce numbing while spinning. But let's focus on one big problem this story illustrates: the issue of samples and populations. Let's pretend for a moment that I'm reasonably confident that knee position is the explanation for my foot numbness problem. Say that I wanted to spread the news far and wide that changing your knee position fixes this problem. After all, if it helped me, it might help others. The problem is that even if we could be reasonably confident that it did help me, we would have no evidence that it would help anybody else. I might be completely unique in this one very odd way. Without studying lots of other people or consulting existing studies that do that, we don't know whether my experience is unique or representative of some larger group. A single data point can't tell us very much, either about the individual case we're directly studying, in this example me, or the wider groups about which we hope to say something. To do that, we need more cases, and we need to be very careful about how we choose them. Now, we can conclude at least one thing from my spinning class experience, though. Clearly, I can't even go to an exercise class without applying research methods to my experience. You may find that's soon the case for you too. Luckily, my friend is also a researcher, so she wasn't offended when I reported back my mixed results. I thanked her for the advice about the knees, and I told her that my feet didn't fall asleep as badly. I said, "I have no idea if your advice is responsible or if it applies to anyone else, but I appreciate it all the same." You'll find that the more you study research methods, the harder it is to say simple things like, "Hey, thanks for the advice, it really helped." Sorry about that. Let's see how this fits into our lesson on samples, populations, and cases. Let's define our terms first and then explore the role they play in research. When researchers refer to the population, we don't usually mean the typical definition, the number of people living in a particular place. But the definition we use in research is related to that familiar one. For us, the population is the universe of cases to which our research applies. The universe of cases includes every possible unit that meets a certain set of criteria that you define. When we look at presidential approval ratings, for example, the population of interest is usually all American adults, or maybe all American adults that voted in the previous election. If you were trying to find the best brunch in town, your population would be every brunch-serving restaurant in town. If you wanted to know customer opinions of your business, your population would be all of your customers. And if you were studying the impact of fishing practices on sea turtles, your population would be sea turtles. Once you know your research project, you have to determine the set of cases that meet your criteria. This might be peoples, animals, organizations, institutions, communities, groups, governments, objects, minerals. It depends on your discipline and your project. The population contains every single instance of these that meet the criteria you establish. Another term we have to define is a sample. A sample is what we call any subset of this population. It's a slice of the population, and we usually have rules about how that slice is, well, chopped off. Think of it like a cake. The cake is the population, and the slice you cut for yourself to eat is the sample. We're often working with samples rather than populations, and we'll talk about why in a moment. Let's return to the example we just looked at. If we're studying presidential approval ratings, our sample would be some portion of the 245 million or so adult Americans, maybe just 1,000 of them. For the best brunch in town, you might restrict yourself to those restaurants within walking distance or a 10-minute drive. To find out customer attitudes towards your business, you might contact a few dozen, those who come in during a particular week, for example, or who are long-term clients. For sea turtles, instead of finding every sea turtle in the ocean, you might try to examine a small number in a particular region. Anytime you're limiting your actual data collection to a subset of cases within a population, you're using a sample. Our final definition is the word I just used, a case. A case is essentially a single unit of what we are studying. So a case would be a single individual adult American asked about whether they approve of the job the president is doing, or one brunch serving restaurant, or a single customer, or just one sea turtle. We'll probably make several observations about that single unit. We might ask the customer how frequently they stopped in our store and how often they buy something, what they think of the price, packaging, functionality, and a choice of options regarding a particular product, maybe a host of demographic questions. Every person or brunch place or turtle is a potential case for us to study. Samples, populations, cases. These are all essential building blocks of research and data collection. No matter what you're studying, eventually you need data. Haphazardly collected data can't really tell us anything systematic, and it can lead to cherry-picking information that supports our own case. That's not a good practice in research. Our quest, remember, is to observe the world and figure out how it works, not to prove ourselves correct about something we think we already know to be true. And good data requires you to be able to offer a strong defense of your population and samples. So if we want to actually put our ideas to a strong test, and we do want that, we do want to subject our ideas to the strongest test possible so we and others can be confident in the results, we need to have good data. We'll talk in a few minutes about the various types of sample selection methods we can use, but first, let's address the elephant in the room. And by that, I mean, why are we only talking about one elephant and not the whole herd? A cheesy way of saying we're going to discuss why we bother with samples at all and don't just work with populations. So why do we sample instead of using the population? After all, the population is the group we really want to know about, so why not just study the whole thing and be done with it? Well, if it were that easy, we probably would. But it turns out that there are a lot of reasons we study a sample rather than the population. First, research is time-consuming and expensive. In our presidential approval rating survey, we would have to track down all 245 million Americans and ask them their opinion on the president. To have any consistency in the results, we would need to do that over a short time period. Otherwise, world events might affect how people later in the survey respond. You would need a massive operation and team to carry that off. It's expensive, time-consuming, and impractical. Second, you also have to consider your skill set as a researcher. Imagine you want to interview people about their social media habits in different countries. Either you would have to be fluent enough in dozens of languages to conduct the interviews yourself, or you'd have to hire people to do the interviews for you. Third, keep in mind that research is cumulative. So you might only study a small sample in your project, but combined with other projects that study other samples, collectively you might be able to say something about the population. So you don't need to study the entire population yourself to have something to say that is of value. Fourth, sometimes the population is so large you can't actually study it. In this world of big data, You can have computer-generated data with over 1 billion observations. Such datasets may be so big that some statistical models can't accommodate them, so you have to sample to make the data more manageable for analysis. Finally, it may not be possible to study the population. The data may not be available. Perhaps you want information on quality of life indicators in different countries, and some countries simply didn't collect the data in your years of interest. In other cases, the population is unknown or difficult to access. If you want to interview suicide bombers, for example, it might be hard to get a complete list of terrorists. And of course, even if you did, your sample would be biased in favor of those who did not succeed in their missions. That's a lot of reasons for why studying the entire population is difficult. The good news is, we don't actually need to study the population. When we use a random sample, we can estimate how well our sample actually represents the population, and we can report how confident we are in those results. Even with a non-random sample, we can discuss the extent to which we can say things about our population after only studying a sample. So samples allow us to take on a manageable project while still answering valuable research questions. Of course, using samples is not without its own dangers. There are a lot of ways to sample, and some are better than others. So you need to make sure you're sampling in a way that makes sense for your project and that follows sound practice. For example, many inferential statistics that we might want to use to analyze our data rest on certain assumptions about how the sample was drawn. If you don't use a random sample, those assumptions could be broken, and the test won't be very useful. Other tests might require the entire population to be included in order to be used. So you might want to consider your plans to use quantitative analysis before choosing how to sample. Two of the most important issues with samples, though, are the problems of generalizability and sampling error. Now, generalizability refers to the extent to which our results from analyzing our sample can be said to apply to the entire population. That is, if we find X to be true about our sample, can we generalize that finding to our population and say X is true for the population as well? For example, if we find that my numb feet in my spinning class are due to poor knee position, can we say that everyone who suffers numbness has poor knee position? Well, if we have a large enough sample drawn randomly from the population of spinners, we can at least estimate how confident we are that the sample accurately reflects the population. If you don't use a random sample, however, you're more limited in how much you can generalize from your sample results to the population. This is why we can't use our own personal experience or those around us to make claims about larger groups. We're not necessarily a good sample of that wider population, and we certainly weren't chosen in a systematic way. It's for the same reason that stereotyping is bad science and dangerous. You hear of a few people who fit a mold and assume that everyone who shares that characteristic is similar. Such assumptions are not formed in any kind of systematic or scientific manner or based on a representative sample, and therefore should be avoided. The second big issue with sampling is sampling error. This is the difference between a sample statistic, such as a mean, and a true value of the population. It's actually highly connected to the issue of representativeness. Anytime you're using a sample, we need to recognize that the single sample you're studying is not the only possible sample you could have studied. Imagine, for example, that you're doing a study of management practices in Fortune 500 companies. Now, 500 companies are too many to study in depth, so you decide to randomly sample 5% of the companies, 25 total cases. You draw your sample, and it features companies like Apple, Nike, and Starbucks. But now imagine that you drew another random sample. This list of 25 companies could be completely different. Say you draw 25 different samples of 25 companies. In all likelihood, there are also going to be differences among these samples. Maybe one sample has a high percentage of companies from the top 10 largest companies, and another is entirely made up of technology companies. You can imagine then that the results of our study will be somewhat different depending on which of these samples we use. Yet, we're only going to use one. This is why sampling error can be a problem. We may claim things to be true of the population when in fact the value for that population is different than that of the sample we ended up studying. This can limit our ability to generalize our results for our sample to our populations. So, samples are very useful and commonly used, but they do have their drawbacks. Let's tackle one more question before we discuss those different sampling methods. What size sample do I need? As with so many things, it depends. In an earlier lecture, we discussed the basic differences between qualitative and quantitative research. Generally speaking, qualitative research is sometimes referred to as small n research. N is just a symbol we use for the number of cases in a study. So qualitative research usually focuses on a small number of cases, while quantitative research, or large N research, focuses on a large number of cases. Small N research can focus on as few cases as one. We call that a single case study. More typically, you might study 2, 4, or up to maybe 20 cases in depth. You aren't usually conducting statistical tests in small N research, so the number of cases is really only restricted by your time and the number of variables you're studying. The more variables you study, the more cases you need. Now, why is that? Well, think about our spinning class example from earlier. I gave you a half-dozen explanations for why my foot numbness improved between class 1 and class 2. That's 6 variables, and since we only had a single case, me, to study, we had no way of isolating the exact reason why I saw improvement. But say we studied 60 people in the 2 classes. We would then have cases of people in class 2 whose knees collapsed inward, or who ate breakfast, or who failed to wiggle their toes, or who experienced no numbness at all. We'd have a better set of data to use to evaluate all these variables. With one case, we can't say much. When it comes to quantitative data, a larger sample is generally better, so long as it is chosen in a systematic way that minimizes sampling error. The closer you get in size to the population, after all, the more accurate results. But given that gathering observations costs money and time, you really want to know how many observations are enough. Luckily, we have ways of calculating the necessary sample size. As one example, let's look at calculating sample sizes for large surveys. We can do this with just 3 pieces of information: the size of the population, the margin of error, and the confidence level. First, the size of the population. How many possible cases are there from which we can draw our sample? You need to have at least a rough sense of this in order to draw an accurate sample. Second, we need the margin of error that you want. This means how much error you're willing to live with. How far off from the true value of the population are you willing to be? The lower this is, the bigger the sample you'll need. Typical margins of error are 3 or 5%. Finally, what confidence level do you want? That is, how confident do you want to be that your sample statistic is the same as the population's true value? This is usually 95%, which means you're willing to accept a 5% chance that your results are completely wrong. But levels at 90% and 99% are also used. As with the margin of error, the higher this is, the bigger the sample you'll need. There are free sites out there that will calculate the sample size for you once you have this information. I highly suggest using them. So returning to our Fortune 500 example, we have a population of 500 businesses. Let's say that we want a margin of error of 5% and a confidence level of 95%. If we plug that information into our calculator, we get 217. That's the sample size we need. More generally, one common rule of thumb for quantitative analysis is to ensure that you have 10 cases for every variable in your study. So if you have 10 variables, you'd want at least 100 cases in your sample. But how exactly do we go about drawing that sample? That is, how do we determine the exact cases that make it into our sample from the population? There are 2 broad categories of sampling: probability samples and non-probability samples. Let's look at probability samples first. A probability sample is one where each unit in the population has a known chance of being included in the sample. When each unit's chance of being in the sample is equal to every other unit's chance, we call this a random sample. So you might take a simple random sample where all the units are in one big group, and you use a random number generator or table to pick individual units until you reach the desired sample size. Or you might take a stratified sample, where you divide the population into strata or groups based on a characteristic of interest, and then randomly sample from each group to determine which specific units go into the sample. So for example, if you wanted a regionally stratified random sample of adults in the United States, you might first divide the population into regions such as the Northeast, South, Midwest, and West, and then randomly sample within each of those groups. In this kind of sample, though, you want to take care that whenever possible, the number of units coming from each group is equal to its proportion in the population. To draw a random sample, you first need a sampling frame. This is some kind of observable list or construction of the members or units of your population. You need to compile this list with care. Obviously, if a unit gets left off the list, it has a 0% chance of being included in the sample, and the sample is therefore no longer completely random. In our brunch example, this means ensuring that every restaurant that serves brunch in our town is on the list. Now, what might some good sampling frames be? Well, you could start with the phone book, which is a pretty complete list of every restaurant in the area, and then call each place to find out if they serve brunch. That's time-consuming, but it's more likely to result in a complete listing than if you just search for brunch on a review site like Yelp or TripAdvisor or on Google. What about a sampling frame for our customer product survey? Now that might be much harder, but maybe you have a customer perks program and this provides you with contact information. But not everyone will have either signed up or given correct information. You might instead have to use a sampling frame of customers who entered the store or purchased a product within a set period of time. Then you can randomly select customers, say every third person who enters or purchases something, and give them a survey. This situation helps illustrate one of the many issues with samples and populations. Sometimes it's impossible to generate a complete population list, so we have to find other techniques to generate a strong sample. Now, cluster sampling can help here. In cluster sampling, you divide your population into clusters, then randomly sample which clusters to use in your study. You might then sample again from within each of the selected clusters. If we're interested in American adults again, we might use cities as clusters and then randomly select one or more cities to be in our sample. Getting a population list for one city may still be difficult, but much easier than doing so for the entire United States. Now, once you've used your sampling frame to create your population list, the next step is to decide your sample size. We talked about how to do this earlier. After that, you have a few options to determine which cases from the list end up in the sample. You can use computer software to randomly select that number of cases from your list, or you can label each case with a number and use a random number generator or table to pick cases. Or you can conduct a systematic sample where you pick every third or 10th or 100th case to go into the sample. Remember though, once a case is in your sample, it stays there, and you can't throw it out because you would have preferred another case to be in there. That opens up the sample to bias. Random samples aren't always the appropriate choice though. In some kinds of studies, you know the specific people or groups you want to study, maybe due to a particular skill set or a variable of interest. In such cases, we turn to non-probability samples. These are samples where the chance of any one unit being included is not only not equal to that of other units, but isn't known at all. An example of a non-probability sample is a convenience sample. You've probably been included in convenience samples before. This is where you get stopped on a street corner and asked to participate in a survey, and whoever stops gets interviewed. It's also the kind of sampling you see in reality competition television shows such as American Idol and So You Think You Can Dance. Basically, anytime the public is asked to vote en masse. Those who choose to call in are in the sample, and those who don't aren't. This is not a good way to sample because the participants are self-selecting, but it's done all the time. Quota sampling is a different kind of non-random sample. Like the stratified samples that we looked at earlier, in a quota sample, you determine categories of interest and then accept cases into the sample until you fill that category. Let's say you want to survey students in a school about their career goals, and you want to make sure you get an equal number of freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors in your sample. So you survey any student you can find until you get to 50 in each category, basically until you meet the quota. This is still a type of convenience sampling, though, and faces the same concerns. You'd probably be better off in most cases going with a stratified random sample. Purposive sampling is more commonly used, especially in small n qualitative research. This is where the researcher chooses a sample with purpose, aiming at acquiring one that achieves certain characteristics. Depending on your project, that might give you more interesting results than selecting a random sample. In our Fortune 500 example, say you might want to purposefully sample the top 10 companies to see their management practices. If you find that their management practices vary widely, this tells you that being a top company making billions in profits doesn't necessarily dictate management practice. Snowball sampling is another sampling method, most commonly used to find interview subjects, especially if the group you want to interview is hard to find or mistrustful of researchers. In this method, you identify a small number of relevant people to include in your sample, interview them, and then ask them to give you some more names or introduce you to other relevant people. You do this until you get the sample size you want. One of my students used this method in a study of Bosnian refugees. The student knew a few people, and following a positive experience in the interview, those subjects were willing to supply more names. Now, there are other ways to sample, but this covers the basics. The goal is to minimize bias in the sample so you can generalize your results to the population, that wider group you may be actually interested in explaining. Identifying populations and selecting samples is tough, and depending on your project, you might not be able to do a perfect random sample. That's okay. Most researchers have to wrestle with incomplete data and imperfect methods. But keep in mind one of our key characteristics of research: transparency. You need to be open and honest about the decisions you made and justify your choices. Acknowledge the issues and limitations that you face, and you're still adding to our incremental understanding of your research area. Aim for perfection or try to hide the issues you faced, and your work either won't get done at all or won't be trusted. In 1968, an Iowa teacher named Jane Elliott struggled with a lesson that she needed to teach. Martin Luther King Jr. had just been assassinated, and the entire country struggled with issues of racism and prejudice. How would she get her classroom of young, white students to understand why someone would want to murder Dr. King? A typical lecture discussion just wasn't going to suffice. She told the class as they came in one day that from now on, their eye color was very important. She informed them that brown-eyed students were simply superior to blue-eyed students. They were cleaner, smarter, more civilized, better. Brown-eyed students earned extra privileges, more time at recess. They could go first to lunch and have seconds if they wanted them. Blue-eyed students had to wear special collars and were not allowed to play with brown-eyed children at recess. Very quickly after this announcement, the children began justifying behavior, their own and that of their classmates, due to eye color. As Jane Elliott said in the Frontline documentary, A Class Divided, she watched, quote, what had been marvelous, cooperative, wonderful, thoughtful children turn into nasty, vicious, discriminating little third graders in the space of 15 minutes, end quote. She also noticed that the activity had an impact on their schoolwork. The students in the discriminated group performed slower and more poorly on their class exercises than those who were in the privileged group. On the second day of the activity, she reversed the two groups, telling the students that she had been wrong the previous day and that blue-eyed children were actually superior. Students who had shined academically the day before now struggled. While Jane Elliott's class exercise doesn't follow all the rules, it has some of the key elements of one of the most important research designs there is, the classic experiment. An experiment, as we've discussed briefly before, is a method where a researcher manipulates one or more variables and then observes the effect of those manipulations on the experiment subjects. The classic or true experiment is the hallmark of research in the natural sciences, medicine, psychology, and many other disciplines. Not every research question can be answered through an experiment, but if all else is equal, you're generally going to get better, that is, more reliable and valid results using an experimental design than other research methods. The reason is that an experiment maximizes the control that you, the researcher, have over your subjects and variables. Control is the key word there. In an experiment, you control your variables and how they are measured. You don't have to rely on a business or government keeping accurate records. You don't have to restrict yourself to how things have already played out in the real world, whether or not a business succeeded or failed, whether countries became democratic or not, or whether or not someone gave in to peer pressure. Instead, you're the puppeteer pulling the strings, and you can directly witness and record the impact of your manipulations. Now, Jane Elliott certainly pulled the strings on her third grade class, but her experiment, while teaching her students a valuable set of lessons on prejudice, would not be considered a true experiment, as it does not meet all of the criteria. It does meet some, however. We're going to discuss 4 features of a true experiment. The first 2 apply to pretty much all experiments. The second 2 are key when you're experimenting on people. These 4 features are control, manipulation, random selection of participants, and random assignment of subjects to groups. Let's look at each of these in more detail. The first feature is control. More than anything else, control defines an experiment. In most of our research designs, we have very limited ability to control the change or administration of our independent variable. We usually have to accept what the real world has given us. Some companies are large and others small. Some countries are democratic and others authoritarian. And some people are born blue-eyed and others brown-eyed. If company size, government type, or eye color are our independent variables of interest, then we as researchers can't control or change that. And that's a problem because our goal in an experiment is to isolate a particular independent variable and see how it impacts a dependent variable. Control means we can prevent outside factors from interfering in the outcome of our study. We do this by using very systematic set procedures that are followed rigorously to ensure that the study conditions are the same throughout, and by using a control group in addition to a treatment group. A control group refers to whatever subset of subjects do not receive the treatment or intervention. A treatment group, in contrast, is the subset of subjects that do receive that treatment or intervention. That's the group that we will manipulate in some way to see how our variable of interest affects them. Now, having a control group is extremely useful. Without it, we don't know if any change observed in the treatment group occurred due to our manipulation or some other factor. Let's say we're studying the impact of sleep deprivation on test-taking abilities. The treatment in this case is ensuring that our subjects have had very little sleep, say 2 hours, prior to taking a test. They take the test and do poorly. Obviously, this poor performance is due to lack of sleep. Well, no, not obviously, actually. It may be lack of sleep, but there might be other factors. Maybe our group forgot to eat breakfast or drank more coffee than normal, or perhaps they just aren't smart and would have done poorly regardless of how much sleep they got. Or maybe the test is just hard. One way to isolate the impact of sleep deprivation on performance is to include a control group of subjects that got their normal amount of sleep. If they too perform poorly on the test, that might rule out our sleep deprivation variable. This is why medical research uses placebos. When people take a drug, they're likely to report a change in their symptoms even if the drug doesn't do anything. The control group takes a sugar pill so that the researchers can document this placebo effect and ensure that any change seen in the subjects receiving the actual treatment is actually due to that treatment. And this isn't just for medical research. Whenever you're experimenting with people, we have to watch out for reactivity, the problem that arises when humans know they're being studied and therefore change their behavior, perhaps without even realizing it. Our second feature is manipulation. This means that the researcher has the ability to manipulate the independent variable by administering a treatment. By introducing a treatment, we're changing the environment of our subjects, and we're able to observe what impact that change has. When Jane Elliott introduced the concept of eye color superiority, she was essentially manipulating the conditions of her classroom. Before, the students had no conception of eye color mattering in terms of abilities or privileges. Once they did, and once Elliott, as the facilitator, enforced certain rules, student behavior began to change, as did performance on tests. Now, these first two criteria are necessary for all kinds of experiments. If you're experimenting in a kitchen, for example, you might try adding a new spice to your dish. That's manipulation of a variable. If you're comparing this new attempt to previous efforts without that spice, you have control. Control and manipulation are therefore vital regardless of what your subjects are or the goal of your experiment. Many of us are interested in questions about people, though, so I'm going to add two more features that are important whenever you're experimenting to learn something about human behavior. Our third criteria is the random selection of participants. In a previous lecture, we spent a lot of time talking about why random selection is so important. As a refresher, remember that it's pretty rare to be able to study the entire group or population we're interested in. So if we want to know how experiencing discrimination affects our test performance, the experiment hidden in Jane Elliott's exercise, then our population of interest isn't just the students in her class, but students more generally. Sometimes our goal in research is to explain events or behavior in one location or a set of circumstances. Or our study may have a tiny population that can easily be studied in its entirety. In those cases, random selection may not be required after all. But if the goal is to say something about a wider population and we can only observe a small subset of that population, then generally we'd like the subset to represent that wider population. The best way to do that is to use a random sample. Now, Jane Elliott's sample was not random. She used her own students in her class, not a random selection of third graders from her school or town. Having a random sample helps increase the external validity of our study, the chances that the results of our study can apply to the wider population, not just those in the study itself. But it's actually quite common in experiments to not use random samples, simply due to the nature of the study or the difficulty of recruiting a pool of random subjects. So while we list this as something to look for in a true experiment, this is one of those cases where, in practical terms, this particular requirement is often overlooked and viewed as ideal, but not necessary. Many experiments rely on non-random samples simply due to the difficulty of finding participants. These experiments do suffer from external validity issues, but that's why replication is so important, so we can see if an experiment completed on one set of participants holds up when conducted on another set of participants. Our fourth and final feature is random assignment. Random assignment means that our participants don't get to choose which group they're placed in. They are randomly placed in the treatment group or the control group. They don't get to choose if they go to a group with a friend or the person they were chatting with in the hallway. Instead, they're randomly assigned by the research team to one of the groups, with an equal chance of ending up in either a treatment or a control group. In a true experiment, random selection combined with random assignment helps ensure that any differences between our two groups is due to chance. That's important. It minimizes the ability of other variables to play a role in any change we observe in our dependent variable. If we see change, we can claim with some confidence that the change is likely due to our independent variable. That gives us greater validity in our study. If you don't use random assignment of subjects into groups, you can end up with selection bias problems. Imagine you're doing a study on whether or not playing with puppies improves people's moods. You let people self-select into groups, those who play with puppies and those who don't. The problem is that those people already predisposed to enjoy playing with puppies will put themselves in that group, while those who don't enjoy playing with puppies, do those people exist? There must be a few out there, but they put themselves in the control group. You can imagine then that your results are going to be skewed. This is why random assignment into treatment and control groups is one of the hallmarks of the true experiment, and why experiments that cannot use random assignments are sometimes classified as quasi-experimental. Jane Elliott's use of eye color to separate her groups isn't exactly random. Some studies have linked eye color to a host of personality and behavioral factors. For that reason, we typically wouldn't want to assign people to groups based on eye color, but instead use a truly random process. So those are our 4 features for a true experiment: control, manipulation, random selection, and random assignment. With them, you're able to use one of our more powerful tools for determining causality. Now, before we move on to some specific true experimental designs you can use for your project, we have to talk about validity again. We've encountered validity before. It's essential to our understanding of measurement. Validity means that any measure of a variable needs to be a valid or true representation of our concept. And to be valid, a measure must also be reliable or give consistent results. We can also use validity in a broader sense than just measurement. We can discuss the validity of our study as a whole and the extent to which it has value. Let's consider 2 types of validity: internal validity and external validity. Internal validity is the extent to which we can attribute any result to the independent variables and not something else external to the study. If we claim our study has internal validity, we're saying we can be reasonably confident that within the study itself, internal to it, we are truly testing the role of the independent variable in affecting our dependent variable. We are, to the greatest extent possible, eliminating outside factors. Think of our study as an old box. Internal validity means we've patched all the holes, taped the sides down, and encased it in steel. Nothing is getting into that box except what we put there. Unfortunately, there are a lot of things that can threaten the internal validity of our experiment. Not all of these can be prevented either. We can design our study to minimize their impacts, but when they do happen, we have to catalog them and then later assess the potential impact they have on our study. The key here is transparency. Be honest about the internal validity threats you faced so that your audience and other researchers can assess for themselves whether those threats are minor or large enough to question your results and conclusions. So let's talk about just a few of these threats to internal validity. First up are reactivity effects, sometimes called the Hawthorne effect. In the 1920s, a series of studies were done at Hawthorne Works in Chicago. The managers at Hawthorne wanted to see if changing the level of lighting in their building could increase the productivity of their workers. There was actually no difference in productivity at levels of low or high light, but instead, productivity increased whenever the lights shifted in intensity, regardless of whether the actual level of the lights were low or high. The researchers concluded that the workers knew that any time the lights changed, they were being observed, and this caused them to increase their productivity. This became known as the Hawthorne effect in research, and it means that people change their behavior when they know they're being watched. When someone agrees to participate in your study, they don't become a blank slate. They're still a person, and they know that you're looking for something, some kind of behavior or reaction or change. Some subjects may try to give you what they think you want in order to be helpful. We call that demand characteristics. Others might deliberately refuse to help you or even try to sabotage you. I had a student once who did that. I experiment on my students all the time. Don't worry, it's just trying out new teaching material to see what methods work best. One time I ran an exercise to teach students about structural inequality in the world and how the rules of the international financial system are set up to privilege already wealthy countries. In the exercise, students that acquire wealth are highly incentivized to keep it, as that wealth would translate to extra credit in the course at the end of the exercise. This particular student, let's call her Danielle, acquired wealth on the first turn, and then systematically gave it away. She disobeyed all the incentives of the game to create a more egalitarian system, finding loopholes in my rules that let her do so. Her reasoning was that she was already doing well in the class and other students needed the extra credit more. Danielle was clearly not a blank slate. She set out to break my game from the beginning. It actually became a pattern in the course. She would make it her goal to break any game that I created. By the time she was a senior, I had her help me run the games as a teaching assistant. I wanted her on my side. The point is, you may have subjects that, knowing you're observing them and perhaps assuming you want them to behave in a particular way, will sometimes change their behavior for that reason alone. It's not your treatment that changed them. It's wanting to either please you or perhaps, like Danielle, buck the system. So watch out for the reactivity problem. You will want to design your experiment in such a way that your subjects don't know what kind of behaviors you're looking for, and set up your observation system so they're as least intrusive as possible. A second set of threats to internal validity are testing effects. Sometimes we want to measure our dependent variable multiple times during our study. That might entail having our students take an exam or fill out a survey or engage in some kind of activity. For the sake of simplicity, let's refer to these as tests. It's possible that simply by taking the same test more than once, you improve your score not because of any intervention or treatment, but simply from being more familiar with the test. Think about a trivia night get-together with your friends. Let's say it's Star Wars trivia night and you get asked the date that the film Star Wars premiered in theaters. The answer is May 25th, 1977. Let's pretend you didn't know that prior to trivia night. You lose the point. But now it's burned into your memory and you decide to join a study focused on best practices in preparing for trivia contests. A month or two later, you go to another Star Wars trivia night and the same question is asked. This time you get the question right. Did your improvement result from participating in the study, or did it happen because the process of participating in that first trivia night embedded that question and answer in your mind? If the latter is what happened, you've got a testing effect. Then we have history effects. This is what we call outside events that occur during our study that may affect subjects. Remember that our goal in an experiment is to control as much as we possibly can. That means we want to ensure the only thing changing for our subjects in our treatment group are the variables we want to manipulate. But if you're doing a study that takes place over time, history effects can threaten the validity of your study. Let's say you're studying the effects of counseling on people suffering from addiction. One of your subjects experiences a tragedy in their life during the study. Perhaps a close friend passes away unexpectedly. That might impact their progress, regardless of the effectiveness of the counseling sessions. A related type of effect is maturation. Subjects quite simply change over time. If your experiment runs for a lengthy period of time, your subjects' beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors may change simply due to the passing of time. This is particularly true when you're studying children or people over the course of their lives. Then there's mortality. While this can mean the literal death of subjects in medical research, we say mortality to describe any time when subjects drop out of the study. For the purposes of our research, they are dead, as we can gather no more data on them. There may be something systematic about the people who drop out that could impact or invalidate your results. Let's also talk about diffusion effects. These occur frequently in educational settings. Diffusion occurs when the treatment meant only for the treatment group ends up being applied to the control group as well. For example, I ran a study where instructors applied the principles of transparent teaching in their classes. Some of them taught two sections of the same class. One section received the more transparent methods and the other did not. The problem is that a teacher, once they've learned how to be a transparent teacher, may find it difficult to constrain those skills and apply them only to the treatment group. And if they think that the transparent methods are better teaching, they may feel that ethically it's wrong to withhold those methods from the control group. In this way, the treatment gets diffused into the control group. There are actually many other possible threats to internal validity. The instrument we use may be flawed or cause an unintended response. There are experimenter effects, where the facilitator of the experiment may mess up in their script, or some subjects may respond differently than others to the person. There's also the issue of regression to the mean, where particularly high or low results go down or up on the next test simply due to chance. We could talk about internal validity a lot more, but we've now covered some of the big ones you need to watch out for. Random assignment to groups is one of the ways that experiments help increase internal validity. Using blind studies or deception can also help. We want to design our experiments to reduce threats of internal validity as much as possible. So that's internal validity. We also need to talk about external validity. External validity refers to the extent to which we can generalize the results we get from the sample we study in our experiment to a wider population. This is usually our goal. Typically, we aren't interested in learning only about the small group of people or other units we actually observe and analyze in our sample. We select the sample from a larger population and then hope that by studying the results of that sample, we can say something about the larger population. So we get a small group of people to play or not play with puppies. We aren't trying to just explain how that group of people responds to adorable puppies. We actually want to use those results to say something about a larger group of people. So a study can be said to have external validity when we're reasonably confident that we can extrapolate from our study's results to that population we ultimately care about. The key to ensuring external validity is to make sure that the sample itself represents the population. This is best done in an experiment by using random selection of subjects from the population. And that's one reason why random selection is one of the features of a true experiment. Also, minimizing some of the same threats to internal validity, such as the Hawthorne effect and experimenter effects, can help preserve external validity. Understanding validity is essential to producing strong research. When designing an experiment, you need to be hyper aware of these threats to validity and do your best to minimize them. In general, experiments can be really strong at internal validity, but because they frequently are done in laboratories and other controlled conditions, they may be less representative of the real world. Therefore, experiments can sometimes suffer from problems of external validity. This is one reason why experiments tend to be replicated. If repeating the study with new participants or environments shows similar results, it can provide support for the external validity of the study. Jane Elliott repeated her experiment multiple times. The documentary A Class Divided actually shows footage from the third time she ran the experiment on her students. She also ran the experiment for a variety of adult groups with very similar results. Those results have been replicated in a wide variety of settings: businesses, schools, organizations, correction facilities, and therefore the external validity of her experiment is stronger than it would be if she had only done it once with a small group of third graders. Let's shift gears now and take a look at three of the more common designs for a true experiment: the post-test only design, the two-group pre-test post-test design, and the Solomon four-group design. In a post-test only design, you only measure the dependent variable once at the end of the study after the treatment is administered. That's called a post-test. You measure the dependent variable after or post the treatment. You would compare the results from the control and treatment groups then to see if there are any differences. Sounds good, right? But there's a problem here. How are we to know that whatever change we might see between the two groups at the end wasn't already there before we started? Even though we may have used random selection in assignment, it's possible that random chance resulted in some systematic differences between the members of the two groups. Maybe we're conducting Jane Elliott's performance testing, but it turns out that the brown-eyed children we recruited for our study actually are, by chance, smarter than the blue-eyed children. We would see that their scores are higher and might assume that our treatment, the various advantages we gave them and not their classmates, is what caused the change. But it's also possible the difference was there in the beginning and our treatment had no effect. By only testing students at the end, we wouldn't know whether it's the treatment or pre-existing differences that explain our results. So what's the solution? Well, one option is the pre-test, exactly the same as the post-test only design, except as the name gives away, we also use a pre-test. We measure the dependent variable at the beginning of the study before any treatment is administered. That's the pretest, and then again at the end in our post-test. We do this for both our treatment group and our control group. In Jane Elliott's study, this would mean testing the student's performance before doing the exercise and then again each day of the exercise. The pretest would provide a baseline that could let you compare the impact of being advantaged and disadvantaged by eye color. Now, sometimes pretesting just isn't possible or isn't necessary for the study. This is one reason why the post-test only design is still in wide use. But there are several advantages to using a pretest. For example, we can compare the pretests to make sure that our two randomly assigned groups are indeed relatively equal. If they aren't, we can account for those differences in our analysis. It also lets us see whether or not the treatment had an actual impact by letting us compare subject scores on the dependent variable before and after our intervention. And we still get to compare the post-test scores of the treatment and control groups as we could in the post-test only design. This two-group pre-test post-test design is fairly common in research. But while it has higher internal validity than the post-test only design, it still suffers from a problem. Taking a pretest by itself can change the behavior of your subjects. Remember the testing effects we discussed earlier and how it can lower the internal validity of our study? Using a pretest can increase the risk of testing effects. This problem can plague the two-group pretest post-test design. So if you have the time and money, a big if, you might consider the Solomon four-group design. It has all the features of the pretest post-test design, but consists of 4 groups, not 2. We still have random selection and assignment. That doesn't change in a true experiment with human subjects. But now we have 2 control groups and 2 treatment groups. In each set of groups, only one group gets a pretest. So we have a post-test only control group and a post-test only treatment group and pre-test post-test versions of both. This is much more expensive and difficult to do than a pre-test post-test design. The extra 2 groups means you need many more subjects. You also need to be able to coordinate the administration of the treatment, and if necessary, a placebo, to 2 different groups at the same time. And the results can be much more complicated to analyze. But there are some clear advantages here. Remember that experiments shine by providing the high levels of internal validity. They give us the greatest control we can get over our variables and how they interact. The Solomon four-group design maximizes that control. It lets us check to see if testing or reactivity effects are present, for example. There are other types of true experiments besides the ones we've discussed here. In some cases, you won't be able to have 2 groups, or you might have multiple treatments, in which case you'll have several treatment groups. Factorial design, for example, lets you consider the impact of multiple independent variables on the dependent variable. But the 3 we've discussed here, the post-test only design, the 2-group pre-test post-test design, and the Solomon four-group design will give you a good starting basis on how to structure your true experiment. As long as you have the key components of the experiment, random selection, at least 1 treatment and control group, control over the variable you want to manipulate, random assignment to groups, and a strong measure of your dependent variable, you should be fine. That is, of course, assuming that your project will allow you to use a true experiment. We'll soon learn about the many occasions when a true experiment is not going to be possible and what your alternatives might be. Previously, we discussed the teacher Jane Elliott's experiment to teach her students about discrimination. She divided her class by eye color and gave one set of students advantages over the other. Students then switched roles the next day, so each student experienced being a member of the advantaged and disadvantaged groups. We reviewed this experiment in our discussion on a true experiment. But Elliott's experiment might better be classified as a quasi-experiment, one that meets some but not all of the requirements of a true experiment. Because of how she structured the experiment, her results didn't carry the full weight of a rigorous scientific finding. But that doesn't mean that her experiment was worthless or that her findings are without merit. Within the exercises, she made a startling finding that student performance on reading, math, and spelling notably declined for students in the disadvantaged group, compared to how students performed when they were part of the advantaged group. Her experiment also showed that the activities she asked her students to undertake left them with a lasting understanding of discrimination. Decades later, her students returned to discuss with her the impact that the exercise had on their lives. Another finding that came out of Elliott's study was that feelings of discrimination can have an impact on test performance. These findings are important and worth taking seriously, but should be interpreted with some caution. True experiments are the hallmark of scientific research, but quite often we simply can't do a true experiment. Consider our criteria for a true experiment: control, manipulation, random selection, and random assignment. First, control may not be possible or desirable. We might be in the early stages of a research project and testing out a particular treatment. In such cases, putting half our subjects into a control group might not be a good use of resources. Second, you as the researcher may not be able to manipulate the variables you need. They may occur naturally in a population you wish to study. Third, limited access to subjects or high costs might prevent true random selection. In fact, very few experiments end up using random selection of subjects. One reason might be because the nature of the study demands non-random participants, such as in a medical study where you may only want participants currently suffering from a particular ailment. Another is pure practicality. Recruitment is difficult, and you work with whoever you can get. Finally, random assignment can be difficult. There are times when your subjects of interest sort themselves into groups, and not always by random. You might be interested in studying economic policies, for example. You can't randomly assign some countries and not others to practice austerity. In these situations, researchers often turn to quasi and semi-experimental designs. And if you find yourself needing to do that, don't despair. As Jane Elliott's work demonstrates, such alternate kinds of research can have tremendous value in answering our questions, solving our problems, and increasing our knowledge of the world. Let's discuss a different experiment so we can get a better understanding of some of the differences between a true and quasi-experiment. In 1973, John Darley and C. Daniel Batson published a study in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology called, quote, "From Jerusalem to Jericho, a study of situational and dispositional variables in helping behavior," end quote. As a side note, I promise you that obscure titles are not required to publish your work when it's finished. You really can be as straightforward and clear as you like. Darley and Batson wanted to test the logic of the Good Samaritan parable from the Bible. In the parable, Jesus tells the story of a robbery victim and the three men who pass him while he is lying half dead in the road. The first two, a priest and a Levite, both religious figures, pass by without stopping, but the third, a Samaritan, who is not a religious figure, stops and cares for the man, even providing payment for further treatment. Darley and Batson wanted to test the qualities that induce someone to stop and help someone in need. That is, they wanted to ask, what kind of person becomes a good Samaritan? They identified three key variables that they thought might influence whether someone stops to provide aid. The first is task focus. They wanted to test the impact of a person's thoughts and focus when they encounter the victim. Is that person thinking about religious and ethical matters? This is separate from being a religious person and instead is about what's on your mind at the time of encountering the person in need. They want to know if someone who is thinking about religious and ethical matters is more likely to stop and offer assistance than someone who's thinking of other things. Second, Darley and Batson hypothesized that time matters, specifically whether or not the would-be helper is in a hurry. The priest and Levite may have had others waiting for them, leaving them no time to help the victim. In a generous interpretation of the parable, they may have felt torn between disappointing those waiting for them by being late and helping the person in need. The final variable is religiosity. They wanted to know if having a specific outlook on religion matters in terms of providing aid to a victim. Specifically, Darley and Batson distinguished between three kinds of religiously focused persons: those who are religious for their own intrinsic reasons, those who seek to gain by being or acting religious, and those whose religious practice focuses on a quest for meaning in their lives. They identified the quest reasoning and the intrinsic reasoning as Samaritan-like traits, and hypothesized that such persons would be more likely to stop to aid a victim. This overview gives us a clear dependent variable, behavior toward a victim, and three independent variables: task focus at the time of encountering a victim, whether or not the person is in a hurry, and religiosity. Darley and Batson set up a very interesting experiment to test their three hypotheses. They recruited seminary students at Princeton Theological Seminary and gave them questionnaires to measure their religiosity. On another day, the subjects returned for the experiment. They were told that they were participating in a study on careers for seminar students, and that they'd be asked to give a short recorded talk on a topic. Based on random assignment to a particular group, they were then told the topic of their talk. Half the group received the parable of the Good Samaritan, and the other half were asked to prepare a talk on the kinds of jobs that seminar students would enjoy and be well prepared for. No group was told that the experiment was designed to test the Good Samaritan parable itself. The participants were further randomly assigned an additional condition. Each person was told to head to a nearby building where another researcher would record their talk. But the urgency of their move to the next building varied. Some were told they had plenty of time, others that they should head right over, and still others that they were already late and should hurry up. On their way to the nearby building, each subject passed an alley. In that alley, there was a person slumped over, coughing and groaning. This person was, unknowingly to the participants, part of the research team and was evaluating their behavior. They used a 0 to 5-point scale to assess the reaction of the subject. A 0 meant the subject didn't notice the victim at all. Those given 1s noticed but didn't offer any aid. 2s didn't stop to help, but they reported the person's condition to the research assistant when they arrived at the next building. A 3 meant the subject stopped and spoke to the victim, perhaps inquiring if they were okay. 4s insisted on helping the victim inside a nearby building. Finally, the highest score, 5, was given to those subjects that stopped and either helped the victim inside a building and refused to leave until assistance arrived, or insisted on taking the victim somewhere else for aid. After this encounter, the participants continued to the building where they gave their recorded talk and took another questionnaire on ethics, just as if the person in the alley was an accidental encounter and had nothing to do with the experiment at all. They then headed to a debriefing session with the facilitators where they learned of the deception in the study and its true purpose. Let me pause for a moment and point out that testing parables and sayings is a great way to hone your research method skills. I once had a professor who asked us to pick a proverb and figure out how we would test it. How might you test "an apple a day keeps the doctor away"? Or "good fences make good neighbors"? Or "absence makes the heart grow fonder"? Do good things come in small packages? Is the grass always greener on the other side? All of these are things you could actually test, just like the Good Samaritan parable. Let's return to our experiment. Darley and Batson found that neither religiosity nor the type of talk the subjects were to give mattered in terms of which people stopped to help the victim. What did matter was whether or not they were in a hurry. Those in a hurry were less likely to provide aid than those who were told they had plenty of time. They did find that among those who helped, those who saw religion as a kind of quest for meaning offered less aid than those who had other religiosity views. Interesting, right? The Good Samaritan study is a strong example of an experiment, if one that is not perfectly a true experiment. Did you spot the way in which this study falls just short of our true experiment criteria? Let's return to our criteria to evaluate it. The criteria, as we just discussed, are control, manipulation, random assignment, and random selection. Let's start with control. Were Darley and Batson able to establish control groups so they could genuinely test for the role of the independent variables in participant behavior? Yes, they did. They tested 2 independent variables in the experiment itself: what topic was on the mind of participants as they prepared for their talk, and whether or not they were in a hurry. Without a control group, we would have had everyone in the study told they were in a hurry and given the Good Samaritan parable. The students in the group told to prepare a talk on post-seminary careers were the control group. Their conditions were in almost every way similar to those given the Good Samaritan parable. They met with a researcher, took a questionnaire, were told to prepare a talk, encountered the victim, gave a talk, took the ethics questionnaire, then headed to the debriefing. Like the treatment group, they also were divided into the 3 hurry conditions, allowing researchers to also test whether or not that variable mattered. The difference was they weren't asked to prepare a talk about the Good Samaritan parable. In essence, we actually had 6 groups, 3 for the Good Samaritan parable and 3 for the post-seminar career topic. Now, as with any social scientific work, Darley and Batson didn't have complete control over their subjects. If you pour one chemical into another, it will obey you every time. Human subjects, as we've seen, don't always do what we want them to. We don't know for sure, for example, that subjects told to prepare a talk on the Good Samaritan parable were actually thinking about that when they passed the victim in the alley. And Darley and Batson reported that 4 of their subjects became suspicious of the experiment at some point, requiring that the researchers remove their data from the study. This is the kind of complication that we don't always find in the natural and physical sciences. Nitric acid never suspects it's in an experiment and refuses to participate. Let's think about the Elliott eye color study again for a second. Did it have a control group? Not really. She divided students into 2 groups, but neither was a true control group. One group received advantages and another disadvantages. A true control might have been to have a 3rd group of, say, hazel-eyed persons who received neither advantages nor disadvantages on both days. So Darley and Batson did okay on control. What about our second criterion, manipulation? Manipulation, you may recall, means that the researcher controls the administration of the independent variable. You're able to assign conditions to your participants rather than having to work with conditions that have occurred naturally. If I'm studying the impact of government type on whether or not a country goes to war, I can't assign each country with a type of government. I have to work with evaluating how they already are. This is one reason, by the way, why political scientists don't tend to use a lot of experiments, particularly when studying international relations. Are Darley and Batson able to manipulate their variables? Well, 2 of them, yes. The level of hurry, for example, was assigned by the researchers. So was the type of talk, the subject's game, which was aiming at putting particular thoughts in the minds of participants when they passed the victim. But the 3rd variable, religiosity, was not directly manipulated by the researchers. That pre-existed the study, and so the researchers measured it in the initial questionnaire prior to the experiment portion of the study, but didn't manipulate it. So Darley and Batson were 2 out of 3 on manipulation. This does keep the study from being a really true experiment. How about Elliott? She did manipulate her variables. She decided which students experienced discriminatory treatment using eye color as her guide. Our 3rd criterion is random assignment. This means that subjects can't self-select into groups, but are instead randomly assigned by the researcher into a treatment or control group. How did Darley and Batson do? Just fine. I mentioned that they used random assignment. They did note that they made an error in their assignment and over-assigned to the intermediate hurry group. But they still used a random process to assign people to groups, which helps preserve the internal validity of the study. How about Elliott? We already discussed that she assigned groups by eye color, which isn't a random process, so no random assignment for her. Our final criterion is random selection. This is what helps ensure the external validity of our study, that is, whether or not we can generalize our results from our participants to a wider audience. We already discussed how Elliott didn't randomly select her participants, but instead used her own 3rd grade students. You've probably figured out by now that this is one place where Darley and Batson fall short, according to my synopsis. They make no mention of their selection process. They just say that they recruited 67 students, 47 of whom participated in the experiment. It's unclear if the total student population of the seminary is 67 students or if the 67 were selected at random from amongst the students there. We also aren't told why the researchers chose to focus on the seminary, nor do they discuss how using a seminary population might limit the generalizability of their results. It is possible that Darley and Batson did use random selection from the students at the seminary and just didn't report it in their article. If so, then their article would mostly meet all 4 criteria. If not, well, it's hard to blame them. Often with experiments, we end up recruiting those who are willing from those close to hand. Many academics use their university students for their studies precisely because they're convenient and usually cheaply acquired, sometimes just for extra credit. So we shouldn't really fault an experiment too much for using a convenient population. We just have to limit our expectations of the external validity of the study and possibly replicate their work. This analysis showed that Elliott's discrimination experiment meets fewer of the criteria for a true experiment than Darley and Batson's Good Samaritan experiment. That doesn't mean Elliott's contribution lacks value, not at all. True experiments are valued because they maximize the internal and external validity of the study. But plenty of studies that are unable to attain that high bar still help answer questions and improve our knowledge. Your goal is to aim for the 4 criteria of a true experiment when possible. When it isn't possible, you do the best you can to still achieve the goals of internal and external validity and acknowledge where you fell short. Think of this as more of a continuum than a dichotomy. You're aiming for the ideal, but falling short of that is definitely not a deal breaker. The goal is to be open and transparent about your methods so that other researchers can judge for themselves the scope and value of your work. Darley and Batson, for example, were open about the fact that only 47 students ended up finishing their experiment, and of those, 7 cases had to be thrown out. 40 subjects is a pretty small sample and limits what statistical analysis can tell us. And yet this study has been cited more than 1,700 times since 1973. Transparency about the small sample size helps other researchers evaluate the impact of the work. Hiding issues or exaggerating claims is more likely to get your work ignored than honesty about challenges, how you address them, and what they mean for your results and claims. So how much can you claim? True experiments let us claim causality because the researcher controls and manipulates the independent variables. When combined with random selection and assignment, this lets us be pretty sure about the role of our independent variable in leading to change in our dependent variable. We can establish cause and effect. In a quasi-experiment, some of these things remain the same. You still have subjects, groups, treatments, and measures of a dependent variable. What you don't typically have is random assignment to groups or complete control over all other possible variables. Differences that arise between your groups, therefore, may be due to factors other than your chosen independent variables. That means that even if we find differences between our treatment and control groups, we can't be confident that they're caused by our independent variable. There are other differences. Quasi-experiments may occur outside of a controlled laboratory environment. This is one reason why the researcher can't control for other variables. And typically, people are already assigned to groups outside of the control of the researcher. So for example, you might want to compare children with different birth orders. You can't randomly assign a subject to suddenly be the firstborn child. Or you might want to see the effects of long-term pet ownership on people's happiness. I suppose you could bring puppies to random participants and wait a few years, but you're probably better off just working with existing pet owners. Another option might be that you want to compare high performers to low performers on some kind of skill. You might have participants take an aptitude test and then assign them into groups based on their scores. That kind of matched group setup isn't random, but it might fit your study. Let's dig into the broad category of quasi-experimental design so you can see the wealth of the viable options you have available to you. Just keep in mind, aim for as many of the elements of a true experiment as possible so you maximize the validity of your work. But if you want to work on a project where some of those criteria just can't be met, you still have a number of quality options available to you. First, we have the single group pre-test, post-test design. There's no control group at all in this design. You measure the dependent variable, introduce the treatment, and then measure it again. Now, if you've been paying attention, you know that this goes against a key idea of an experiment. There's no control group. Experiments are all about control. But there are reasons to sacrifice control. Single group pre-test, post-test designs are often used as pre-experiments or pilot studies. It's a way of testing out your ideas on the cheap before committing to a full-fledged experiment. Let's think this through. When we're using treatment and control groups, we're really looking for two effects. First, we want to see that the treatment matters for the treatment group. That is, the dependent variable changes after the introduction of the independent variable. Second, we want to see if the control group shows no change. If the control group changes too, then we can't really say that our independent variable is what caused the change, right? That's why control is usually so important. But if the treatment group shows no change, you don't need the control group. That alone tells you that your treatment doesn't matter. One of the key roles of the control group is to help us eliminate other variables, not just establish the viability of the independent variable. That's why running a pre-experiment pilot can be so valuable. It tests to see if the treatment matters. If it doesn't, you end the study without committing to the greater expense of adding a control group. Remember, that's a lot of participants to recruit, each of whom might need to be paid for their participation. If you do find results in the pilot, that can justify the further expense to grant agencies to do a more thorough study. So let's say you have an idea for a new training program in your company, perhaps on methods to increase work productivity. You've discovered a new task management system that works really well for you, and you're curious if it would help others in the office as well. You know from our previous discussions that your personal experience alone may not be representative, so you want to do a pilot study before suggesting widespread adoption of this new software. Now, you could build a true experiment to achieve this. You could get a random sample of employees and randomly assign them to one of two groups. One group receives the treatment, which is training in how to use this new task management software and committing to use it for, say, 2 weeks. The other group gets no training. Both groups take questionnaires at the start and end of the experiment to self-assess their productivity. But is all of this really necessary at this point? You just want to know if your new task management system that you like so much might help out others in your office. To use another proverb that we might want to test someday, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Why not go with a one-group pre-test, post-test design? Recruit some coworkers, have them fill out the questionnaire self-assessing their current productivity, train them in the use of the software, and then test again after the 2-week period is up. If you see strong results, you could then do a second run with a control group to check for the influence of other variables. It might be, for example, that simply being asked to focus on productivity makes people more productive, or that a Hawthorne reactivity effect is occurring. But it's also pretty common for a pilot study like this to forego the full study with the control group and just to use the results to assess whether or not employees should be trained in the use of this software. Just be honest about the limits of the pre-experiment, and the results may differ when other groups undergo the training. Another type of quasi-experiment mimics the true experiment in all but one way. It's called the non-equivalent groups design. You have two groups, one treatment and one control. You measure the dependent variable for both groups. You introduce an intervention to the treatment group and then measure again for the two groups. The only difference, and it is a big important difference, is that the assignment to the control and treatment groups is not random. Instead, you end up using pre-existing groups that are similar, such as two organizations or communities of the same size or that consist of the same people. Let's say that you want to study the impact of participating in a simulation on student learning. You're interested in whether participating in the simulation is enough by itself, if it needs to be combined with a lecture for maximum impact, or if lecture alone is best. So you give your 3 sections a quiz on the material, then lecture to 2 sections of a class, but not the third. One of the lecture-only sections does not participate in the simulation, but the other 2 do. All 3 sections then take a second quiz on the material. This is definitely quasi-experimental. It's taking place in a real-world setting, a classroom. Assignment to each group isn't random, and there may be systematic differences between the 2 groups. There are also some concerns about internal validity, testing effects, history effects, and Hawthorne effects, for example, that might interfere with your results. And yet, none of this would negate the potential impact of such a study. The key is to recognize these potential limitations, try to minimize them where possible, and ultimately report them when you write up your results. Again, what these designs have in common is that they fall short of the ideal criteria of a true experiment. That means we're not able to draw as many conclusions from quasi-experimental approaches because they lack the highest levels of internal and external validity. Quasi-experiments are much more susceptible to the threats to validity that we discussed in our last lecture. Consider history effects, for example. Since the researcher is usually not controlling the conditions in a laboratory and sometimes is just observing the impact of variables they did not themselves introduce, outside events can have a potentially large impact on the study's results. Laboratory experiments are more controlled and tend to be shorter, and therefore may not be as susceptible to this. For the same reason, maturation effects can also be an issue in semi-experimental studies. There are many other kinds of experimental designs that we haven't considered. Repeated measures designs, for example, are experiments where you take measures of the dependent variable at multiple times across the experiment, looking at the impact of the independent variable over time. For example, if you're studying weight loss, you would take multiple measures of weight, say once a week, while in the intervening periods you're introducing your independent variable, perhaps dietary restrictions or an exercise program. This allows you to look at effects over time. In our example of task management training programs, you might want to measure the dependent variable a few times, perhaps immediately after training, again 2 weeks later, and yet again 6 months later. That's a repeated measure design, and it would give you a sense of any long-term changes that the productivity training might have. Interrupted time series designs are a version of this, where you typically measure the dependent variable at least 3 times before treatment and 3 times after treatment. This can help reduce the role of maturation effects on your study because you're documenting changes in your subjects both before and after the treatment. There are also single subject experiments. In these, you start off with a control or baseline condition in a single case, then introduce a treatment, then return to the control condition. This lets you test to see if the treatment matters. This kind of design is something you might use in your daily life. You might, for example, go from not drinking coffee to drinking a cup a day to not drinking it again to see the impact the caffeine has on your system. There are, of course, many other quasi-experimental designs, but these are some of the most relevant ones that you can use as a basis for designing a true or quasi-experiment for your own research project. Remember, the key in any experiment is to maximize your internal and external validity. Be open and honest about the design of your experiment and the way in which you try to achieve these goals. And be clear about the impact that not achieving them might have. Say, for example, you're not able to engage in random selection, but are instead reliant on those who are readily available to you. In education research, for example, you may need to work with your own students, as Jane Elliott did and as I often do. The key is recognizing the impact that this might have on external validity. Do your students share certain characteristics that might limit the ability to generalize from your results to other populations? If the answer is yes, it's fine, really. Don't attempt to overstate your claims. Your work still has plenty of value, and you or other researchers might try to replicate it with different subjects, which will further test the external validity of your claims. You don't have to do everything in a single study. You just have to be honest about what you have and have not achieved. Let's start out this lecture with a short quiz. Don't worry, it won't be graded. Question 1. At big holidays, some people eat like birds and others like horses. What did you nosh on for breakfast at the last major holiday? Question 2. Many people consider breakfast to be the most important meal of the day, essential to good health. Do you always give breakfast to your kids every morning, like a good parent? Yes or no? Question 3. Which is the perfect breakfast meal? Pancakes or eggs? Question 4. At what time do you eat breakfast? 6 to 7 a.m., 7 to 8 a.m., or 8 to 9 a.m.? And question 5. On a scale from 1 to 5, where 1 means strongly disagree, 3 is neutral, and 5 is strongly agree, how do you respond to this statement? I make time for breakfast every day, and I eat it at my kitchen table with my family. That's it. So, what did you think of my quiz questions? Did you have trouble answering any of them? Did they seem like the typical sorts of questions you might see in a survey about breakfast? If I asked you to give me feedback on my quiz, what advice would you offer? Now hold on to those thoughts as we'll come back to them later. The quiz we just took is, of course, a type of survey. If you've ever filled out a questionnaire about a product, or rated a customer service agent after a transaction, or completed a census form, you've participated in a survey yourself. It seems that everyone wants our feedback on everything nowadays, preferably on a scale of 1 to 5 stars. Fundamentally, surveys are tools. They're questionnaires designed to gain feedback from multiple respondents on a given set of topics. The goal of survey research is to identify characteristics of a given population, people's attitudes, beliefs, goals, behaviors, preferences, opinions, by asking them questions. Surveys can be incredibly varied in length, approach, distribution method, and types of question. When surveys are aimed at a smaller number of people or allow the interviewer to significantly adapt his or her questions in response to what the respondent says, we refer to those as interviews. When we ask small groups to meet and offer their opinions, responding to each other as well as the interviewer, we call these focus groups. Classic survey research, however, focuses on interviewers following a set list of questions in a structured questionnaire to a lot of people, allowing researchers to compare data across a large sample of the population. They tend to produce more quantitative data compared to interviews and focus groups. Surveys are one of the easiest data gathering techniques to use. If you've got a computer or even just some notepad and a pencil, you can make a survey. You can use them for your own individual project, a team project at work, or for a volunteer organization or religious group. Want to know what the problems or needs are in your organization? Survey. Want feedback on your role as a leader or how a workshop you ran went? Survey. Looking to get a sense of the reception of a new product or campaign? Survey. Interested in the opinions of your social network on any subject, such as where the best breakfast in town can be found? Survey. One thing you can study via surveys, for example, is happiness. National Geographic and Gallup teamed up to find the happiest places on Earth. They conducted more than 250,000 interviews with people about a variety of things, including 3 different measures of how happy they were: overall life satisfaction, day-to-day happiness, and finding meaning and purpose in their lives. Their research found Denmark, Costa Rica, and Singapore to be the happiest countries on Earth. The happiest cities in the United States: Boulder, Colorado, Santa Cruz, California, and Charlottesville, Virginia. You can do a single survey of people to get a snapshot of their perspective at one point in time, or repeat the survey at regular intervals to see changes over time. You can even do an experiment within a survey by giving different questions, wording, or prompts to a sample of your respondents. For example, in one study, the researchers asked people how happy they were, but some were asked on sunny days and others on rainy days to see if the weather played a role in their self-reporting. You have a lot of choices in how to administer surveys. They can be done in person or by direct mail, phone, email, or the internet. You can imagine that some of these are going to have higher response rates than others, and getting high response rates is difficult in surveys in general, so be prepared for that. In-person interviews tend to have some of the higher response rates, partially because it's easier for the interviewer to build rapport with the respondent. Telephone interviews with a live interviewer have less of that connection, and due to call screening, lead to a lot of survey requests being ignored. Direct mail and internet surveys allow for greater anonymity for the respondent, as respondents may be less likely to worry about giving an answer an interviewer might not want to hear. They are also very convenient for the respondent, but can frequently be ignored or forgotten about. Sending introductory messages and reminders or providing a financial or other incentive are all ways you can increase your response rate regardless of which method you use. Although more and more people's concerns about privacy are inhibiting response rates and quality regardless of the mode of distribution that you use. Another factor besides your method of administration is cost. Conducting a survey can entail large costs in terms of both time and money. You have to design the questionnaire, determine the population, draw a sample, send requests, send follow-ups, and possibly train other interviewers to administer the survey. Then there are the monetary costs of printing surveys, paying interviewers, postage, or phone fees. Clearly, a massive in-person national study will cost the most, while internet surveys cost much less. In addition to being low cost, one benefit of doing surveys via the internet or email is that you can use open source survey software. You can write questions using a variety of options: open-ended questions, multiple choice questions, questions allowing you to rank a set of options, and more. Most survey software includes intuitive question templates, so you can easily ask exactly what you want to know. Survey software also lets you use branching and skip logics. These allow you to direct respondents to a specific set of questions based on what they've already answered. For example, say you work for a zoo and want to find out what the public would most want in a new exhibition. To do this, you might want to know what exhibits a person is most likely to go to: the big cats, the monkeys, the snakes. You might therefore start your survey by asking how frequently the respondent goes to the zoo. Let's say our respondent, we'll call her Danielle, says she has never been to the zoo. Well, you don't want her next question to then be what exhibits she tends to visit. That question doesn't apply to her. Using skip logic in the software, you can indicate that any respondent who answers, "I've never been to the zoo," is automatically skipped past the questions about zoo behavior. So Danielle answers never and is automatically skipped ahead. She never knows there were questions about zoo behavior, and she's less likely to stop filling out your survey because the questions don't seem to apply to her. Alternatively, you might want to know why Danielle has never been to the zoo. She is a potential new visitor. In that case, you might use branching logics, which route respondents to different parts of the survey based on their answer. Instead of skipping ahead, Danielle is taken to another part of the survey that asks questions about why she's never been to the zoo. Too busy, doesn't approve of zoos, and maybe try to find out what might make her more likely to come to your zoo in the future. Using branching logics, you can ask different questions of different respondents without making the survey experience of any one person too long or cumbersome. Now, you can do all of this without using software, but it does make it easier. And since there is user-friendly software available for free at the basic level, the monetary cost is usually quite low. You can distribute your survey via an email or by setting up a link somewhere, and therefore don't have to face the costs of copying, printing, and mailing, or hiring telephone or in-person interviewers. The least expensive option for conducting a survey is actually to use existing archived survey data, such as the General Social Survey, a national survey on American attitudes, behaviors, and attributes conducted since 1972. Don't put in the work of creating your own survey if the data you need already exists and is publicly available. The literature review should tell you what is out there already on your topic. So let's say that we've decided our project is suited to a survey and that we've settled on how we want to administer it. The next step is writing the survey. First, consider how many questions should be on your survey. The fewer questions, the more people who will be willing to respond, which gets your response rate up. But this also means you gather less data from each respondent. More questions lead to a richer data set, but people might not be as willing to participate in the first place or may quit halfway through. Survey fatigue is a real thing. One time I went to a theme park in Orlando, Florida, and after spending the entire day running around and riding roller coasters, I decided to head back to my hotel. On my way out, a young woman with a clipboard and an official-looking name tag stopped me and asked if I would complete a short survey. I agreed. She asked me a couple of questions, and I thought we were done. That would have been great. I was exhausted from too much fun, but I didn't mind giving her a minute or two. But then she tried to usher me to a seat where I'd fill out a much longer survey that would take 15 minutes. At that point, I apologized and refused. 2 minutes, I was willing to give. 15? Way too much after a long day, even though as someone who does survey research, I was very sympathetic to her need to recruit subjects. So try to find that happy medium in your survey and only ask as many questions as you absolutely need. In some cases, a single question might be enough. If you do plan to use a survey that will take a respondent's time, say 10 or 15 minutes or longer, you might consider offering an incentive. You may have encountered these offers. Fill out this survey and be entered into a drawing to win an iPad or something like that. These kinds of offers depend on your available resources, of course, but even offering a $25 gift card to one lucky respondent can be enough to encourage people to participate. If the Orlando theme park had offered a drawing for free tickets to the park, I might have found the energy to give them 15 minutes. Next, you might want to include some questions that ensure the respondent is eligible for participating in your study. If you're sampling in such a way where specific individuals were selected for the sample, then you need to make sure that the person responding is that individual. Perhaps you're interested in studying tourist perspectives on your city. In that case, you want to make sure that the person you stopped on the street is in fact a tourist. So you might want to ask them their city of residence and whether they're in town for business or pleasure. In the case of my Orlando theme park, the people doing the survey first wanted to know if I was staying at one of the theme park's on-site hotels. Presumably, if I had said no, they would have sent me on my way. Now, most of your questions are going to center on getting the necessary information on your independent and dependent variables, just as with any data gathering. But you may also want to get information on alternative and control variables, as well as information about your respondents. Many surveys, therefore, will include questions about demographics, sex, gender, age, income, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, education, religion, county or state of residency, marital status, occupation, employment status, nationality, and many others. These demographic questions can be very useful to compare subgroups within your respondents. So you can compare men to women or younger people to older people. Now, you won't necessarily ask all of these. Only ask the ones that make sense for your study and that will give you useful data. Remember that demographic questions can bring up sensitive issues, and if they're poorly worded or seem completely irrelevant, they might lead a respondent to quit your survey. This is why many people typically put demographic questions at the end of a survey, and why you include options to let people not answer questions. Now, let's talk about how to actually write all these questions that we've been discussing in a way that will give you the results that you need. Here are some tips. Tip number 1. Use plain, neutral, and objective language. We need to make sure that respondents clearly understand what we're asking so that they can give us accurate responses. That means our language must be plain, easy to understand, neutrally worded, and objective. In some cases, you may have to have your survey translated or include an interpreter in your planning. Don't use technical language or jargon that your respondents won't be able to follow. For example, I could ask you if you've recently suffered from acute rhinopharyngitis. Or I could just ask if you've had the common cold. Remember your audience. If you have to use jargon, make sure you provide a clear definition. Let's take a look at the breakfast survey we used at the start of this lecture to help us understand tip number 1. Question 1 asked, at big holidays, some people eat like birds and others like horses. What did you nosh on for breakfast at the last major holiday? I spot several major problems with this question. First, there's some jargon in here. The phrases eat like birds and eat like horses are both idioms that might be unfamiliar to some of your respondents. The word nosh is Yiddish in origin and may not be in common usage. A second problem is that even if respondents do understand all those words, they're misleading. The part about eating like birds and horses is about the amount of food they eat, while the question I'm actually asking is about what they ate. Your respondents may be confused about what you're actually asking them. Third, the use of the phrase major holiday will denote different things for different people. What is a major holiday? Does Labor Day count? What about Arbor Day? Or March 25th, known as International Waffle Day? In some places, holiday means vacation. So if you meant Thanksgiving instead of the respondent's cruise to Mexico, you better be careful. The final problem is one of memory. How likely is it that your respondents will specifically remember what they ate for breakfast on that last holiday, whatever day it might be? I can barely remember what I ate for breakfast 2 days ago. And many holidays connected with food tend to focus on a big meal later in the day, not breakfast. To fix this question, you might ask, the last time you ate something special for breakfast, what was the occasion, if any? The answer choices could be no occasion, birthday, anniversary, Thanksgiving, etc., or just leave it open-ended. Or you might ask them if they were celebrating an occasion by having a nice breakfast, what would they eat? Both of these get at the same ideas as the original question, but avoid some of those language pitfalls. Another important aspect of tip number 1 is to use objective language. That means you shouldn't use any judgmental words or tone in your questions. As researchers, we have to approach our material neutrally, and we don't want to bias our respondents to answer in any particular way. Don't try to make them answer the way you want. Instead, aim for honest responses. Question 2 said, many people consider breakfast to be the most important meal of the day, essential to good health. Do you always give breakfast to your kids every morning like a good parent, yes or no? This question is terrible. It definitely violates tip number 1. It starts by priming you with a claim about breakfast being important for good health. Note that there's no citation or quote supporting that statement. Instead, it's relying on you believing that this is common knowledge, even though this is actually a contested claim. It also assumes that you have children. Now, maybe our survey is restricted to a population that only includes parents who live with their children. If that's the case, this isn't an issue. But if this survey includes non-parents or parents of children no longer living at home, how are they supposed to answer this question? This question also states that a good parent would give breakfast to their children every morning. Imagine you're a respondent and talking to a live interviewer. You're thinking in your mind, well, typically my kids eat breakfast, but sometimes we're running late in the morning, so I don't always do this. Do you answer with complete honesty and say no? Clearly, the interviewer is implying that there's only one right answer here. You might fudge it and say yes, even though, strictly speaking, the honest answer is no. This kind of behavior is common in surveys, as respondents may try to please the interviewer. It leads to social desirability bias, something we'll discuss in our next lecture. It also creates the problem where you, as a researcher, assume that a no answer means the person is a bad parent, when the reason the respondent said no is because they don't have children or perhaps can't afford to feed their kids breakfast regularly. A question like this is simply not going to give us very useful results. There's another flaw in question 2. It uses the words always and every. This is a violation of tip number 2, which is avoid using absolutes. Absolutes such as always, never, and every may encourage respondents to answer untruthfully or may prevent us from gathering useful information. Even someone who typically doesn't eat breakfast has probably eaten breakfast at least once in their life, while someone who never skips breakfast could call to mind the one exception. So how do we fix question 2 so it follows these 2 tips? Well, we want to eliminate that first sentence, as all it does is prime our respondents to answer in a particular way. We also want to eliminate the use of the words good parents, always, and every. Instead, consider what the point of this question is. What information do we really want here? We probably want to know how often the children in the household eat breakfast. One way to find that out would be to first ask if there are any children living in the household. If the respondent says no, then skip the question about breakfast entirely so you don't waste their time. If they say yes, you might then ask, how many days a week typically does each child in the household eat breakfast? And then provide them with a way to respond for child number 1, child number 2, etc. Another way would be to ask, how many days a week do you typically serve breakfast to at least one child in the household over the age of 1? The responses can be open-ended, or you can provide a range of possible responses. Note that these new versions have no priming material or judgmental language. They're neutral. We're not giving off any signs that we will judge the respondent as a poor parent if they say 0. We also remove the absolute language, letting the respondent simply tell us the number of days. This actually gives us more useful data, as instead of comparing yes-no, we could compare 0 days to 3 or 4 days to 7 days. Notice that we also aren't lumping all the kids' behavior together. It's possible that one child eats breakfast every day and another only occasionally. Tip number 3 for good question writing is carefully consider your response options. First, you need to decide whether your question should be open or close-ended. An open-ended question doesn't offer any suggested response options. It lets the respondent say whatever they like in response. A close-ended question, what we typically call a multiple choice question, offers a set of possible responses that the respondent picks from. There are benefits and drawbacks to both. Open-ended questions are less restrictive and let people offer responses that you, as a survey creator, may not have considered. They're also great if the list of options is too long or if including a list might bias the responses. They can be difficult to code, though, as you will need to analyze the responses to find commonalities between respondents. Close-ended questions are much easier to code and typically take less time to answer, but by restricting the possible responses, you can force people into choosing options that don't quite fit them. The order of those responses can also matter. Subjects may look at a list and pick the first one that applies to them without reading the rest. Our breakfast survey questions 3 and 4 are both close-ended questions. Question 3 asked, what is the perfect breakfast meal, pancakes or eggs? And question 4 asked, what time do you eat breakfast, 6 to 7 a.m., 7 to 8 a.m., or 8 to 9 a.m.? In both questions, the respondent is given a list of all possible responses, pancakes or eggs, and time slots from 6 to 9 a.m. Consider how restricted a respondent might feel. Apparently, the perfect breakfast meal in the mind of the researcher only consists of 1 out of 2 foods. For some of us, it might be both of those things or neither. Where's the croissant, the French toast, the yogurt, and what does the word perfect mean anyway? There's a serious reliability problem there, as what is a perfect meal to me might be different than it is for you. Question 4 makes the same mistake by only giving you 3 options for the time you eat breakfast. There's no allowance for those who eat breakfast at 5 a.m., 10 a.m., or 4 p.m. There's also an assumption that you eat at the same time every day, which may not be true. To fix these, we need to consider the second part of tip number 3. The first part considered whether you should use open or close-ended questions. The second part is this. If you use close-ended questions, make sure the responses are exhaustive and exclusive. Exhaustive responses mean that there's a possible and accurate response for every single respondent. Each subject should be able to find an answer choice that applies to them. Exclusive responses mean that those answer choices don't overlap. A respondent may have trouble choosing between 2 responses such as agree or strongly agree, but they shouldn't have 2 categories that both apply, such as female and age 25 to 40, unless you want to allow them to choose every category that applies. Question 3's possible choices are neither exclusive nor exhaustive. Someone might want to select both pancakes and eggs as their perfect meal, while others would prefer toast, cereal, waffles, coffee, or any number of things I can't think of. Question 4's possible choices are also neither exclusive nor exhaustive. Someone who eats at 7 a.m., for example, could choose either 6 to 7 a.m. or 7 to 8 a.m. and still be giving an accurate answer. Meanwhile, someone who eats later in the day or never eats at all has no response choice that applies to them. Let's try to fix questions 3 and 4 by applying tip number 3. First, question 3 about our perfect breakfast meal is probably better off as an open-ended question. That allows people to be as imaginative as they want without having to conform to what the researcher might consider a perfect breakfast. It also leaves the option of people saying none. So we might just say, describe your perfect breakfast meal, or if we want to make sure that people focus on the food and not the location or setting, list the food and drink items in your perfect breakfast meal. As for question 4, this could also be open-ended, but honestly, it doesn't need to be. Listing some times of day won't restrict imagination regarding when people eat breakfast. Depending on how specific my research question requires me to be, I might change the response options to 2 or 3 hour ranges and use descriptive categories such as early and late morning. I would include ranges for all hours of the day and an option that says, I don't eat breakfast, I don't know, other, and I prefer not to answer to make sure it's truly exhaustive. Next up is tip number 4. Avoid double-barreled questions. A double-barreled question is one that asks 2 questions under the guise of asking only one. It usually happens because we're trying to cram a lot of ideas into a single question and don't realize that the response to one part of the question might be different from the response to the other. That's the danger of the double-barreled question. We can't rely on the results because we don't know which part of the question our respondents are answering. Let's look at question 5 in our breakfast survey. Question 5 asked, on a scale from 1 to 5, where 1 means strongly disagree, 3 is neutral, and 5 is strongly agree, how do you respond to the statement? I make time for breakfast every day and I eat it at my kitchen table with my family. Do you see the double barreling here? It's actually triple barreled. I'm asking you about whether you eat breakfast every day and whether you eat it at a kitchen table and whether you eat it with your family. You might have a respondent who does eat breakfast every day, strongly agree, but only sometimes at her kitchen table. Is that agree, neutral, disagree, and never with her family? Strongly disagree. How should she answer this question? If I want accurate results on all of these things, I need to ask about them as separate questions. I can still use the same prompt with the 1 to 5 scale, but then I should have my respondents rate each item separately. So they should use the scale to rate their agreement with 3 things. I typically make time for breakfast each day. I typically eat breakfast at my kitchen table, and I typically eat breakfast with at least 1 member of my family. This change will give me all the information I want without forcing my respondent to choose which part of the question to answer accurately. I can get accurate responses to all 3 parts of my question instead by making sure everything is single-barreled. Finally, tip number 5, adapt from existing resources. Survey research has decades of history, and there are many guides out there on how to write good survey questions. In the case of demographic questions, for example, you can and should draw on existing models. It not only lets you take advantage of expert advice, but also allows you to potentially compare your results to those of other researchers investigating similar subjects. Existing resources will also advise you on important issues such as question order. You may notice that a lot of surveys will start with simpler and non-controversial questions before moving on to tougher questions. You'll see that similar topics get grouped together, and you may get a strong sense of what a typical length or set of topics might be for survey research in your area. Use these resources and adapt them for your needs rather than starting from scratch. There are plenty of survey research software options out there to assist you. As we discussed earlier, they can help you quickly build a survey with all kinds of different question options. Not just open-ended and multiple choice, but checkboxes, rank ordering items, scales, and all kinds of other options. Even better, they can produce reports for you, running basic descriptive statistics and showing you graphs and tables so you can see patterns in the responses. That brings us to the end of this lecture, but not our discussion of surveys. Next time, we're going to look at public opinion polls, a particular kind of survey, and consider a few more important ideas on survey research.